everybody. I go ahead and call roll. Chair Du Bois. Councilmember Filseth. Councilmember Fine. Here. Mayor Scharf. 3 present.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Nadia Naik from CARD and Friends of Caltrain at the moment. I'm here to reiterate what Adina has been talking about, which is that they are doing the presentations for the Dumbarton Rail Corridor. There's a couple of meetings coming up, but notably there's nothing in Palo Alto. And so I really would urge you guys to see if there's a way that they could come and present to the full council. They're presenting everywhere in San Mateo County, but not for us. And as you guys know, Dumbarton Rail Corridor actually has a huge effect on traffic in Palo Alto, and I think it's a big deal. So I would urge you guys to think about maybe putting that on and trying to get them into City Council. I know it's tight, but they're trying to move very, very quickly with this. They want decisions within the next month or two. We're hoping to be able to dive into some more of the details. Some of the things that are so it's good that they've started the report, and there's some things that need to be tweaked. For example, they're looking at being able to have bus and rail, but they would then eliminate the bikes, which kind of doesn't make sense because bikes don't take up a lot of space. So I think, there needs to be some tweaking, but overall it's excellent that there's a study, but I think you guys are going to want to dive into those details. Thank you.
I'll provide more information on the Dumbarton study under the next agenda item.
Next speaker is Roland.
Thank you, and good morning. And I absolutely second everything Nadia said 100%. But the reason I'm addressing you today is to give you a heads up of a letter that you're going to be receiving from me, hopefully next week, which essentially is going to echo what I said at the TAC and the PAC. Is we look at what's happening and at what Caltrain's plans are, there's absolutely no way they're going to be able to handle the demands we're going to have on the system, especially now with what Google is doing and in the Sunnyvale area. Actually, this is going to hit Mountain View because they're slap bang in the middle between Mountain View and Berries About. So the proposal is that we're going to double the length of every single baby bullet platform to 1,400 feet. And obviously there's one in Palo Alto. Now, Diridan, we tackled this over 6 months ago. We saw it coming. We got 9 platforms at grade, and hopefully we're going to have 2 underground platforms also the same length, which will have the same capacity as the 9 at grade platforms. We're done with Mountain View. So far, the reception's been good. Sunnyvale, I think, know what's coming. And then now I want to talk about Palo Alto and talk about some of the opportunities here. So essentially, it's 1,400-foot platforms. It's 4 tracks so that you can pass, traffic can go through. You don't block the line like they do in San Mateo County. And it starts off by branching off the line for about 800 feet so that you branch off pretty close to maximum speed. You now got your 1,400-foot platforms and another 800 feet at the end, so the total thing is 3,000 feet. But since you're looking at grade separations, it gives you an opportunity here with Alma. If you start forking between the bridge and Alma, you will have 4 tracks at Alma. And then the situation is there is no such thing as a grade crossing with 4 tracks. You get automatic grade separation. In terms of funding, the opportunity that you have is not just the $700 million that the VTA have for grade separation, but you can also use some of the $300 million because you are increasing line capacity, which is what those $300 million are there. So there'll be a letter over to you with more details and what the opportunities are in Palo Alto. Thank you.
Our last speaker is Richard Brand.
Good morning, Richard Brand, 281 Addison. Good to see everybody again. Since the last meeting, there was an announcement that made by High Speed Rail that they have to tunnel 14 miles to get through Pacheco Pass, which this didn't come up before, and I just want to make the committee, if you're not aware of it, that's the case, and it's, I don't know, Nadia, it's about $1.3 billion per. Anyway, it's a very expensive tunneling project. I think that if they're going to go ahead and do that just to get into San Jose directly rather than over the Altamont Pass, as you've heard me talk about, I think they ought to have money for us to actually pay for grade separations. And I don't know how, I have to think about how we might address that, but San Mateo County got funded for some of their grade separation requests from high-speed rail, and that's something that, I know we're going to get into that in the other agenda item, but I'm just putting that out there as something new. Maybe we go back and request high-speed rail representatives to come back in again. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So we'll proceed to item number 1, a review of the rail program.
Sure. Good morning, Chair, members of the committee. I'm Joshua Mello, Chief Transportation Official with the City of Palo Alto. Included in your packet is a rail program briefing paper which covers the period from June 15th to August 2nd and provides you with an update on all the activities that transpired over that period. Item 1 was the planning for Community Workshop 2. I'll talk a little bit more about this in our presentation on the next steps for the program. However, it is important to note that this workshop will be held on September 16th at the Palo Alto Arts Center Auditorium. It'll have a similar time frame as the previous workshop on May 20th, which was 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. with a lunch provided during a break period. And I'll talk more about the programming of that workshop later in my presentation. Item number 2, we've also tentatively penciled in a community workshop number 3, for October 21st, also at the Community Arts Center Auditorium. Number 3 in the briefing packet is an update on the community questionnaire. If you remember the meeting that the Rail Committee held prior to summer break, we discussed doing a community questionnaire in order to solicit input on the problem statement, the objectives, and the evaluation criteria. The questionnaire was extremely successful. We had almost 800 unique responses to the questionnaire and got some incredible feedback on the problem statement, the objectives, and the evaluation criteria. And that feedback has been incorporated into the presentation that we'll see later on those components of the program. Item 4 in the briefing paper is an update on a Measure B Caltrain grade separation program meeting that city staff had with VTA staff on August 2nd. This was a very productive meeting. We learned a lot about their approach to the Measure B Caltrain grade separation program. Some key takeaways from that meeting are that VTA is working on an RFP currently to complete an implementation study to determine how to best allocate that funding and construct all 8 grade separations over the 30-year tax time frame. We will be involved in the preparation of that RFP. I assume we'll be able to provide comment. Their goal is to kick that off in early 2018. They were excited to see that we were making progress on our planning efforts. They also seemed open to discussing some creative ways to utilize the grade separation funding. They seem open to closing grade crossings, redirecting some funding to maybe some more expensive grade separations. They also seemed open to changing the language that we are concerned about. We're still in discussions with them. They haven't made that change yet. The final program guidelines are going to the VTA board on September 7th, so that's our last chance to get this language changed. And the language I'm referring to is funds will be allocated to the most cost-effective grade separation alternatives. We feel like this may preclude communities from adding local funding and other funding sources to do something that may be more expensive, but in the community interest. So we've recommended some changes to that language that would more specifically call out cost-effective use of Measure B funds. And that would leave open, other alternatives that may bring some additional funding to the table. We have talked to staff from Sunnyvale and Mountain View, and Sunnyvale concurs with that change. I have not heard back from Mountain View yet, but we have asked VTA staff to make that change before the September 7th meeting to the program guidelines. Item number 5 in your briefing packet is an update on the Dumbarton Transportation Corridor Study. I've also attached the presentation that was delivered when they announced that the draft plan was released. I'll be attending a stakeholder meeting at Menlo Park City Hall this afternoon, which is all of the agency representatives that are involved in the Dumbarton Transportation Corridor Study. I'll be able to provide further information after I attend that meeting. Our speaker, Nadia Nyack, did mention there are some public meetings that are also scheduled. We've also reached out at the request of the chairman to invite Samtrans here to present on the study, and they have agreed tentatively to attend the September Rail Committee meeting if you all are interested in having them present. The public comment period is open until the end of September, so we fully expect that we'll be drafting a letter after we receive some input from you, and I think we can wait until after the presentation from staff before we start drafting that letter. We do have till the end of September to submit comments. Item number 6, recently San Gabriel, in the San Gabriel Valley in Southern California, a trench, a railroad trench was opened, and this committee asked for some information on that. So I've included a budget. It was a little hard tracking down any kind of project fact sheet or any information for the specific project, but I was able to determine that it's a 1.4 mile long trench. The total budget was $312.7 million. And they separated several roadways using the trench. They did an interesting thing, which is create a JPB just to construct these grade separations. And what's included in your packet is actually the 2018 budget for that JPB. And it has some pretty detailed information on the funding sources and the total budget and some photos of the project. And this was really the only information I could track down without actually calling somebody from the JPB. And if you'd like additional information, I can do that and see if they have any kind of project fact sheet or update specifically on the trench project. And then finally, in the briefing paper, we have the latest expenditures from our consultant team attached. And I will say that we had a little bit of a reset over the summer with our approach to the rail program. Starting this summer, staff has taken more of a leading role in the management of this program, and we're using our consulting team strategically for technical support and community engagement support when needed. But going forward, you'll see staff play a larger role in this process, and that's why the briefing paper was actually prepared by staff this month. So with that, any questions on the briefing paper, I'll be glad to answer.
Anybody have any questions? So we do have some members of the public. Maybe we should have them speak quickly and then go back to questions. So on item 1, we have Richard Brand, followed by Elizabeth Alexis.
Yeah, Richard Brand. I applaud Joshua. You've done a good job here in this report, and I especially like it. It was brief, to the point, and covered a lot of the things that are needed to be covered. So once again, I thank you for that good work. One of the things about the Dumbarton thing is included in here in the meeting, and I'll be at that meeting tonight, and I invited Joe Simidian to come too, is that it's true. We have no representation from VTA going to this at all. I'm glad that our city is taking that option to go. I wondered if we can get our old colleague Mark Berman involved in this too. Might be something that the committee would do, to send a letter to Mark and say, hey, Mark, I need a little help here, because it's a regional issue. It's not just a San Mateo County issue. So I just offer that as a thought. I think that the committee ought to consider sending a note to Mark. Thanks.
Thank you. Elizabeth Alexis, to be followed by Roland LeBrun.
Good morning. Yeah, I want to talk about the VTA piece also. I think, while we're making progress, I think we really need to push for a reset of the VTA's entire approach. I mean, on two different levels. I mean, I think they have now sort of said that this isn't just like a bike project, grant program where, a couple of good projects will rise to the top, that yes, we do need to do everything. But they're still talking about a 30-year time horizon. And that's just not the time horizon that Caltrain is going to be on. Transbay Terminal is going to open sometime between 2025 and 2030. Caltrain demand just from that alone will double. The number of people who live in Palo Alto who take the train will probably triple, just based upon analysis that we've done with sort of similar BART towns. The same kind of thing will happen in Sunnyvale, though, and will happen in Mountain View, and even before then. I mean, we see 8 trains for Caltrain in not that distant future, and we would see 10 trains for Caltrain by 2025. No major, during the peak hours, no grade crossing will effectively be open after that time period, or one of the cities will stand in the way of the expansion of Caltrain, and the option is gridlock on 101 or people going there. I mean, whatever we do, it's a bad situation, and the entire county needs to mobilize behind this idea that this needs to get done. And I've heard, well, it's a 30-year tax measure. Well, you borrow against sales tax. I mean, the $700 million that they have is in 2017 dollars already. They've already assumed that it's sort of borrowed, and right now interest rates are low and they might not be low in the future. I mean, we need to reset this as something where everybody's major, I mean, we need Sunnyvale stuff to get done, we need Mountain View stuff to get done, and this idea of pitting everybody against each other, they should simply allocate it out, divide up by the number of grade crossings per city, and then let the cities allocate across their own, make their plans. No one is going to be wasting money, right? I mean, everybody's projects are going to cost more than their pro rata share of the money. Everybody. So everybody will have to come up with the difference. So there's the incentive to do that, and we need to make this where we all understand we are all in this together instead of some kind of competition. We do not benefit. I mean, we will have a time pressure of Caltrain's expansion. The cities will have that, but quite frankly, the other cities also, they need to have some planning time, and we have heard this competition, we're falling behind. I know the situations in all those cities. They are not going to benefit either by rushing their programs through.
Thank you. Next speaker is Roland, and then our last speaker is Dean Levin.
So that was a perfect segue into my public comment right there, and we know there's this massive problem. We see it right there. We're not seeing any answers in the Caltrain business plan. That's why we decided to take the matter in our own hands. And we also know that, realistically speaking, the entire peninsula will not get grade separated. So regardless of what we do in Santa Clara County, you can get stuck. But we do have an opportunity, if they don't get their act together up the road, is to actually start taking trains up the mountain rail and address the congestion that way. So half of the traffic would be going across the bay and the rest would be going to San Francisco. But anyway, I want to talk about what's going on with Dumbarton Rail, and I think Nadia already brought up one of the problems. The figures they gave us last night that they need 65 feet for the trains are totally incorrect. That's 4 tracks. We're only going to have 2 tracks. They only need 35 feet, which means there's plenty of room left for a peds and bike trail. And I put a post on Adina's blog last night that actually gives the references directly from the Caltrain engineering standards and how the calculations were arrived at. So that's point number 1. We also, I don't know if you know what Shin is, what the deal with Union City is. Union City is what blew up the entire Dumbarton Rail last time, okay? Because they won $400 million to reroute Ace and Capital Corridor to Union City BART. We have said from the beginning we don't need this. I mean, this is just a boondoggle. All we need is Shin, which is where BART and the tracks intersect. So you can transfer from Capital Corridor and Ace right there at Shin. It's not going to be an infestation. It's just going to be a pure transfer station. There's $130 million right there in RM3 that MTC have approved for this, okay? So last night we were hearing from Caltrain, the $130 million is not all for Shin. We're seeing this over and over again over there at Samtrans. This got to stop. We got to get rid of these people. They keep ripping us off. The $12.5 million to refurbish the Metrolink cars, well, look at what's there, okay? They're not red, okay? They're still gray, just like they were in Metrolink days. The money's gone. The $125 million bridge loan, while we're waiting for the FFGA to come through, that money is also gone, okay? And it just goes on and on and on. It's got to stop. Now, going back to Dumbarton Rail, one thing they're not even considering is a tunnel. it's not even on the map. If we tunnel, we will be able to grade separate both Willow and University. Just think about that. I mean, what that would do for us. Okay, right there. I think that's it for now, but we're going to go up there tonight. I strongly encourage you to go to East Palo Alto and listen to what's going on. My take on this, we're going to have to ask Facebook to basically take over the entire thing and just get the job done. We're never going to get anything done with Centrans. Thank you.
Okay, our last speaker is Adina Levin.
Good morning, council members. Adina Levin, Friends of Caltrain, and here to piggyback on what Ms. LeBrun just said about the Dumbarton corridor. And while we're not done pouring through their several hundred-page report, the fact that this is ambitious and it's talking about ridership on the level of the mid-20,000s to 30,000 is good. That's really different from what came out a decade ago, which wouldn't have been worth investment, and this is worth investment. But there's also a lot of specifics in there that are worth a lot of attention. There's near-term bus improvements that make eminent sense and could be done tomorrow, which are great. But some of the issues in there in terms of how to use bus and rail together seem really perplexing in terms of how you would actually run a transit system. The fact that it's multimodal, great, but how they work together is kind of odd. The having buses and rail use the right-of-way and crowding out the bikes, the data that came to Palo Alto from Stanford on the GUP showing 20 to 30% bike mode share within 5 miles when you have good connections, that could suck up 20 to 30% of the drivers between Redwood City and Facebook. If that was done, and it's basically ignored because the MTC model doesn't forecast bikes and therefore you can't forecast bikes. That needs attention. The proposed improvements, not only, it looks like there's about $800 million in freeway Ising 84 in there, with the hope that it will improve the traffic. But if you have drivers coming up, they still need to get off of 101, and how much extra room is there on Willow Hill towards 101 or University Hill towards 101? None. So will that actually just move the bottleneck? That needs a lot of attention for the amount of money towards the amount of value. And lastly, even though there's all kinds of details in there that need to be hashed out, it's good to see the funding in the expenditure plan for RM3. And if somebody made a call, it's time to make a call again, because that expenditure plan is in flux. There are political issues in Sacramento causing people to be fighting over what's in there. And so talking to Mark Berman and Mullen and Hill and anybody else you have relationships with, let's keep the money in, figure out what to do with it, and pay a lot of attention towards making it good. Thank you.
Thanks. All right, so back to the committee. Does anybody have any questions on number one?
Yeah, I do.
I do too, but go ahead.
So, I think that the change. Oh yeah, sure. So the change in language, if we get it, and I guess Mountain View hasn't weighed in. Is that it? The practical difference of the language is the language we're suggesting allows us to do a trench if the trench is cost effective. Is that roughly the difference?
The language that we're requesting would give communities more flexibility to add additional funding on top of Measure B for something that may be more expensive, like a trench.
Okay. So it's basically adding it basically allows us to take whatever the low-cost alternative is, add any money to it, and do, as opposed to not getting the money because it's not cost-effective.
The current language makes it sound as though VTA will judge the projects based on the total cost when they measure the cost effectiveness, not the cost effectiveness of the Measure B funding. And using Measure B funding to leverage local funding and other funding is actually more cost effective than just picking a lower cost alternative.
So Mountain View people tell me that they're pretty much done, that they're ready to go, they're looking for the funding, they're hoping to get the funding to fund the whole thing and move forward with their grade separations. And Sunnyvale tells me they're going to have, do you know their process? Because I think they said something to me like they're basically planning on 2 meetings and then just
Yeah.
moving forward.
I have a table, and I'll talk more about that later, but they're ready, they're going to have preferred alternatives identified by early 2018, and then they're going to move into design.
I mean, it seems like both Sunnyvale and Mountain View are going to get their grade separations, and that they're moving really quickly. I mean, that seems to be the facts on the ground. Have we had any discussions with VTA? I mean, do we have any commitment at all about, you know, the whole 30-year thing really concerned me as well, and I think it concerned the speakers. And do we have any sense at all of what they're thinking on that stuff?
We know that they want to build all 8 grade separations. We know that the horizon for the sales tax is 30 years.
But are they talking about bonding, or are they not?
They have not talked about bonding recently. That was a question we continue to ask through the, whole Measure B development process. And I would assume they're still talking about that, their financial folks, but we haven't heard an update on that recently.
And then, in terms of the trench over San Gabriel, the relevance to us is that it shows what a trench might cost, or does it not really have any relevance? I mean, we did some preliminary estimates of what a trench would cost. I remember us having our consultants look at that. But what do we think the relevance of that is, frankly, to our own trench numbers? And what will it take for us to actually get some context around what a trench would cost? Those kind of information. What are the constraints on building a trench? I mean, what's that going to take from this committee?
So we provided the information on the San Gabriel Trench at the request of committee members. I do not know enough about the project to know how relevant it is to our trench discussions. We can look into that and, get some more information on that project if that's something you're interested in.
No, if it has no relevance, I have no interest. What I'm interested in is knowing what it would cost to build a trench in Palo Alto. And so my question is, if it does have relevance, I want you to look into it, but if it's really not that helpful, then I want to know what it would take to get good numbers, or at least starting to get some handle on a range of numbers, or, where we are on that.
So we're planning to start the development of alternatives at the September 16th Community Workshop number 2. Very in quick order, upon starting the alternatives to development, we'll start putting together some planning level cost estimates to get a kind of a magnitude of cost for things like a trench and a standard overcrossing, an undercrossing. So I think September, October, we'll start to get a handle on what the order of magnitude is.
Right? So there's the overcrossing, but do we have any issues? Does VTA have any issues with that's an elevated track, right? On an elevated track, it's a overpass, and then we have the underpass, and then we have the trench. Is there any other options?
I think there could be a whole host of different options.
Like what? I can't think of any.
Closure, hybrid, which is, raising the rail a little bit, lowering the road a little bit. It's also going to depend on the location of the overcrossings and undercrossings. How do we interface with Alma Street? Do we, sever the connection with Alma Street, or do we, raise or lower the intersection? I think there's going to be a pretty significant number of, in our universe of alternatives before we start to narrow down. We'll start to have this discussion pretty intensively in September and October, and I think we can narrow them down relatively quickly when you start looking at costs and constraints.
Okay.
I had a couple quick questions. The Arts Center auditorium, is that the space in the back?
Yes.
So are we concerned that it's not large enough? The first meeting probably wouldn't have fit in there, right?
Yeah, there's 180 seats available, and we're going to use the courtyard as well for activities. The weather should be good.
Okay, I guess we don't have a choice for this next meeting, but the third meeting, again, I'm just concerned it's not a big enough space.
Yeah, we're very limited on the space that's available. We tried to get the Mitchell Park
Even
room
in
again.
October?
Yeah, there was very little availability for Saturdays.
And are there any other spaces larger than the Arts Center? Cumberland?
Claudia helped secure the space. I don't know if you have any more information, Claudia. I don't think there's a space large enough at any other location.
We do have the Arts Center, which holds 180. The October dates, we had originally like a late October date for Mitchell Park, and then when we changed dates, it was tough to find a place. You know, we've looked at other venues that are not public facilities, like the Elks Club, things like that. You know, it does have a cost. So I think the Arts Center, we've had some large gatherings there, and we do have the courtyard, which you know, it should be nice weather. So at least in terms of activities, we can search for the October date. See,
Yeah, I'm just, again,
Yeah.
if we could get to September, and if we have standing room only, we may not have enough time to adjust, so.
I mean, the El Palo Alto room definitely holds more, for sure.
Yeah, and I know, and like we did the sustainability summit in the multipurpose room at one of the schools.
Right.
There might be some other options like that.
Right.
So glad to hear about the conversation with VTA on funding. Is there recognition that like Measure B funds aren't going to cover all these grade SEPs? I mean,
Yes, and I think the implementation plan is going to look at what other potential funding sources there are. I think they'll look at a high level at what a package could be for the whole 8. You know, VTA does have the ability to program other federal funding
okay.
through their TIP.
So that they can help us with that. We could do that ourselves as well, right? Look for other sources of funding.
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad to hear that we got Samtrans committed. I guess we'll talk about that at the end of this meeting. The San Gabriel Trench, I guess, I found it very interesting. The part that I found relevant was, again, the funding plan and looking at how they put together a bunch of funding sources. Mm-hmm. And I guess we'll talk about it in the next item. One of my concerns is that this isn't a linear process, and we should really probably start to talk about a funding strategy sooner rather than later. And, you know, they, just looking at it pretty quickly, they looked like they had 35% of the funds were state grants, 40% came from the MTA, you know, 25% were kind of federal and local together. But the idea of a JPB to like assemble all these funding sources looks like a pretty big effort and something that, you know, we haven't even started to talk about. And then the last one, again, appreciated this report and the staff taking more of a leading role. Notice that like 72% of the funds on the circulation study have been spent. When are we expecting to get that study?
They are working on the modeling of the scenarios right now, and as soon as they're in a legible format, the output's in a legible format, we're going to have a meeting with them and put together a draft report on the findings.
Is that going to be used at the next public meeting?
That's the goal, yes.
Okay. I mean, if it's not ready, it seems like that's pretty important information to start to look at alternative impacts.
Yeah, they started modeling immediately after the last after the time period for comments on the scenarios expired. We directed them to begin modeling those scenarios.
Okay. Cool. I guess that was it. So thank you. Yeah. Adrian?
Thank you. Thanks for this report. A few things. So I actually agree with Councilmember Du Bois about the JPB. I thought it was interesting. So one was the organization they used. The other thing was kind of they were looking at multiple, you know, trenches in multiple areas, and they had a pretty nice project plan for citizens showing like where they were in the works. And I think Sunnyvale does a good job of that too. With regard to VTA, so do I understand you correctly that there are multiple agencies helping VTA write an RFP to study how to disperse the funds?
VTA is authoring the RFP, and we will have input into the scope, and you know, we already gave them some opinion on the timeline, and but the project will be managed by VTA in consultation with you know, Palo Alto, Mountain View, Sunnyvale, and Caltrain.
Okay, so do they not have established ways of dispersing funds like this?
They you know, a lot of their funding programs have different criteria and different grant, you know, they use competitive grants for a lot of the programs like OBAG and TFCA and some other funding streams. This is a little bit different, and I think they recognize, well, it's a little bit different because they've to date committed to delivering all 8 grade separations. So to do a competitive process would not work because you wouldn't be able to strategize about what the funding package looks like for all 8. So I think this is a a different animal when it comes to, all of their different funding programs.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just echo what some of the public speakers said. Like, this seemed like a public, county-wide measure. And as you mentioned, there's an opportunity here for each local municipality to leverage their own matching funds, right? And VTA should be looking at that bottom line. What can we do to help? I mean, should we contact the VTA board?
I think we need that language changed before it goes to the board on September 7th. And we have the example, the recommended language in the briefing report.
Can I jump in? This was my questions were going to be. By the way, sorry guys, I didn't wear the staff uniform today. The check shirt, dark jacket, and the jeans. I really apologize for being out of uniform. I agree with what Elizabeth was saying. I mean, first of all, it seems absurd that we would be thinking about trying to do this without bonding for it at all. I mean, over a 30-year period, if we have $2017 and the elasticity of sales tax over that period of time, even there's an equity issue about really who's paying and who is benefiting. So, I mean, is this completely open and up for debate, or are we able to get that commitment in some way? Because without it, I really think we're at risk, and I think it's very difficult for us to be doing any near-term planning on gap funding if we don't know what and when dollars are going to be available.
So I think a lot of this discussion will occur in the development of the implementation plan, because they're going to look at what the bigger funding package is. Can they deliver all 8 with their existing funding sources? Do they need to bond? I think we need to stay on top of, we need to make sure the scope includes things like, that would be needed to do an analysis of whether bonding will work and those types of tools.
Well, I just think we need to die on this hill, honestly. I mean, or else the whole
it's not
thing's
happening.
moving.
Okay. I think those are my questions for now. Thank you.
Great. All right. Let's move on to item number 2. The small.
So in the interest of allowing all of the committee members to participate in, the maximum amount of discussion, we've broken this into 2 separate discussions, 2 separate presentations. The first on the process, the context-sensitive solutions process, and then the second part of the presentation and discussion will be on the problem statement, objectives, and evaluation criteria. So Councilmember Philseth is going to participate in the first part of the discussion, which is the process, and then he'll recuse himself for the second part of the discussion, which is the problem statement, objectives, and evaluation criteria. Do you want to?
The advice of the city attorney is because I live within 500 feet of one of the grade separations that I am conflicted.
Are we going to be talking about specifics of grade subs, or are we talking about overall objectives?
Is it helpful if I chime in? Yes. Good morning. City Attorney Molly Stump. So the conflicts rules include a set of rules on real property proximity to significant projects or events. The problem statement talks about the 4 grade crossings in a way that takes them all as a group and talks about beginning a decision-making process on potential projects in the grade separations. Councilmember Philseth does own real property quite proximate to one of the crossings. Councilmember Fine asked whether the public generally exception would apply here. It does not, because that exception means that to qualify for that, the decision at issue needs to affect 25% or more of property in substantially the same way. And while the grade separation solutions at the 4 crossings will affect all Palo Altans, and in fact, people throughout the region who travel to Palo Alto, it does not affect them all in the same way, both in terms of short-term construction and long-term solutions. The properties that are very proximate to the crossings will be affected in a more intense and quite distinct way from others who may live further away, who will also have some effects, but not similar effects.
So, Molly, it did strike me that the Alma crossing, where Councilmember Philseth lives close, is actually very different and distinct from the other three crossings and the issues facing it. I actually was wondering if we could segregate out the other three, do a problem statement for them, and then have a discussion to see if we want the same problem statement for Alma, because Alma actually is a completely different animal in the way the whole thing looks.
So
And
we definitely.
that would work for me.
We certainly looked at that segregation rule. And again, for those who aren't familiar, that allows a decision to be broken into pieces and taken separately to narrow the recusal. But there are some specific requirements to use that rule, and we don't think that we have access to it under the currently defined process at this time, although hopefully at some point we will. So what it requires is that the piece that where the conflict lies, which in this case is the Alma Street crossing that's close to Councilmember Philseth's real property, it has to be able to be addressed in a way that is not linked in any way to the remaining items that the council member would participate in. It can't be linked in terms of money, timing, engineering, policy. It has to be completely separable. And it very well may be that at some point in this process, one or all four of the crossings are separated out to be considered in a distinct way. But right now, at this early stage, as we read the report, we really are talking about them as a group, and there are potentially some trade-offs and exchanges to be made in terms of priority and approach, where a decision on one will impact a decision on another. And given that situation, it can't be separated at this time.
Can you just clarify, is Councilmember Philseth going to participate in the overall objectives and criteria that's at a high level?
So certainly Councilmember Philseth has participated thus far on the rail policy statement. That is at such a high level that we think that works. There are some procedural items in terms of how the city is going to tackle this conversation that we've been able to say those really don't have to do with the specific potential options at the crossings, but then the problem statement then actually does.
Yeah, we have broken the presentation into the first part will cover the process, including a discussion of how decisions will be made. And then the second part will delve into the problem statement, objectives, and evaluation criteria.
It just seemed like the criteria and objectives were totally general. There was nothing specific to grade crossings. But I guess we could take this up for maybe future meetings.
I think we all are sensitive to wanting to maximize participation while making sure that we follow the ethics rules. So I think as the process works its way forward, the staff and council can be mindful of ways to frame these items that come before the committee and the council to allow that.
To Councilmember Scharf's point, Mayor Scharf's point, the Alma Street crossing is such a different beast than all the rest of these. And essentially all the discussion that we've had dating back to 2010, right, has been how do we deal with rail between San Antonio Road and at the very, very north part University, right? Everybody assumes that, basically there's not that much to be done with the Alma Street crossing. It's not the most critical one anyway, right? All the issues related to crosstown traffic and so forth associated with the entire rationale for doing grade separation don't apply at the Alma Street crossing, okay? So it seems ridiculous. I'll use the word ridiculous, okay? That, the Alma Street crossing should be dragging around policy on how Palo Alto deals with grade separations.
So it may be then that in this process, as it moves forward in the near term, there can be some priority on defining that approach to that crossing in some way that's distinct. But remember, it needs to be distinct in terms of budget and funding availability. In other words, for FPPC purposes, it can't be the case that the funding and the timing of one, say, approaches on the mid and south Palo Alto crossings are in some sense linked or traded off against. If that's the case, then they're not separate for conflicts purposes. But if the conversation is framed in a way that focuses early on separating out that, then I think we would get sooner to this place where we really did have the separation, and then there would be the ability to participate in the other crossing discussions.
So I think that's a good question that you frame it that way, is that, and I agree completely with Councilmember Filseth in that, you know, all of the tough issues here relate to the other three crossings. And I almost think we could segregate that crossing out. I mean, we're probably not going to be grade separating that one on the same time frame. You know, that may be the 30-year grade separation is the one down there. The other three are hopefully much sooner. So I'm wondering what that segregation would look like. And obviously, we're not going to solve that today. But the question is, what would you need from the committee and from the council to segregate this in a way that would allow Councilmember Filseth to participate? And obviously, that's not necessarily the goal, but my gut sense is that the Alma Street crossing is so different than the others, and in terms of funding, timing, and all that, that I think that that's the way it would go. But we need to obviously have that discussion and decide. And obviously, we wouldn't be just doing it for you. I think it just falls that way. So the question is, if we have those votes and we have this discussion at council, how do we segregate it out? And we should do that earlier. And if we're not going to segregate it out, I think Councilmember Filseth should know that as well. So how do we do that? That's really the question.
Well, we certainly know what the conflicts rules are, they're settled, and what they require. What we don't know is how this conversation is going to progress. So if that's the committee and the council and the community's intention to address that issue and separate it completely in terms of, so that it's not linked or related to the other set of decisions in timing, budget, engineering, policy, then, you know, we can support that as a staff, we can get there, and then we'll be in a situation where we can use that rule.
Let me ask, maybe this is the same thing a slightly different way, or it's maybe slightly different, but, you know, how we define the problem, does that make a difference? Because if we define the problem, right, as by 2025, Caltrain is going to be running 10 trains an hour in both directions, right, and it's going to be impossible to get by car from one side of Palo Alto to the other, right? If we define that as the problem, the Alma crossing is irrelevant to that issue, right? So if we define that as the problem, then can I unrecuse?
We'll need to look at the rest of the decisions and see if we've met that legal standard of having any approach at Alma not be linked to the rest of the crossings. So, for example, if there is a substantial question that the community and the council needs to grapple with about other types of improvements at Alma, are those prioritized for budget and timing purposes first or behind other crossings? Then I think for FPPC purposes, they're going to say that those decisions are not fully separate, that one, in fact, depends on the other. And so then they would say that that standard for separation is not met.
And
but
yet even that can't be a totally black and white thing, because, I mean, you could make an argument that if we decided to declare, you know, Alma Street a quiet zone, then that's going to take a certain amount of money. And, you know, digging a trench in South Palo Alto, that's going to take a certain amount of money. So it's all money, so they must be connected, right? Well, that's ridiculous, too, right? So how do we differentiate that?
So I'd like to suggest we just have this conversation after this meeting. I think I don't see us changing the decision for this particular meeting, and then we should work this out before the next meeting.
So I agree completely with that. I think the only difference is if we have to give direction to staff to ask what that would look like and what decisions we'd need to make. I mean, right now, I don't know how we make that decision without us making decisions about how we break it up, right? I mean, I think I need a staff report, something that says, you'd have to take it this way, you'd have to make these decisions, the community would have to look at it this way. I mean, I don't see how we can I don't see how you can get to what you need, and Councilmember Filson can get, without staff telling us what we need the decisions to look like. from this committee and this council, because it's how we phrase it, whether or not he's recused. I mean, we could just say, we're not dealing with the Almond Street crossing. We're not, we're not going to grade separate. We're not looking at it. It's a separate path, separate track. I'm not sure, I'm not saying advocating that or thinking about it, but that would be a decision that would seem to allow him to participate. Or we can say, we're going to look at the Alma, but it's a different, and then you'd have to tell us what that looks like. Am I wrong on that?
Well, I think we do need to work our way forward, but I hope that I've been clear about the standard. So, for example, if there's a common pot of money that is available for all of these projects, simply declaring that the Alma Street project is separate is not going to meet the standard.
It seems to me that if you were going to have any more of this particular conversation, at a minimum, it should take place at the end of this process discussion, because I think that there are some implications for the process discussion, even based upon these kind of conflict issues.
Yep. Okay, so why don't we go ahead with the staff presentation?
Great. So as I mentioned earlier, we've broken this presentation into two parts. The first will cover the context-sensitive solutions process. As you know, there's been a lot of discussion about whether or not to have a stakeholder committee as part of this context-sensitive solutions process. Back in the spring, prior to our May 20th community workshop, we presented you with this table that shows kind of the 5 steps, 5 decisions that need to be made moving along this process at the top, process milestones. In order to move this forward, we decided to come to you and recommend that we just move forward with stage 1 of this, which was to create a community engagement plan and then host the first community workshop with the goal of getting to a problem definition, objectives, and evaluation criteria decision point. We're currently at that point today. We went to Planning and Transportation Commission August 9th. We are bringing this forward to you today on August 16th, and then we're planning to go to City Council. There's a little bit of a change on this. We were originally going to City Council on August 28th. It's now September 5th. That has been moved forward a week. And then finally, we're hoping to go back to the community for Community Workshop 2 on September 16th. We do believe that the process that we're following adheres to the context-sensitive solutions principles. This is from a report documenting successful context-sensitive solution processes. Just to take a step back, context-sensitive solutions came out of, and it's a solution, so highway departments were really struggling with how to integrate transportation facilities into existing communities, particularly after the adoption of NEPA back in the 1960s. And historically, they had just used cookie-cutter highway designs and, plowed through existing communities and neighborhoods. And, some pretty cutting-edge DOTs started to deliver projects that were context-sensitive, so sensitive to the context that they are located in. Those became known as context-sensitive solutions, and then a whole group of academics and others started to look at how those projects were delivered and found some commonalities in how those projects were delivered. And that became the so-called CSS process. But ultimately, CSS is judged on, the context, how well a project fits into its context. Does it enhance the community? Does it create barriers? Is it in harmony with the surrounding community, and does it solve community problems, or is it just addressing something that a bureaucrat in a DOT decided was a problem? So that's the origin of CSS. So out of all those studies and kind of forensic audits of how these projects were delivered, some principles were developed. And the principles are, really around continuous engagement of the community, thinking about the context of where the project is located. Every single neighborhood is different. Every single context is different. So a cookie-cutter highway design or a grade separation design is not going to work in harmony with every community. Every community is different. One of the key components of context-sensitive solutions is transparency. So continuing communication and collaboration with the community. You don't come to the community after a decision is made in a back room and say, this is the alternatives that we developed. What do you think? That's the, the design and defend model where engineers and others sit in a room and they think they know what's best for the community, develop a solution, and then come out and present it. Have a faux public hearing where they take comments from the community and then go back and come back with something that's very similar. This is a totally different process under CSS that's much more transparent. We've brought those principles into our rail program. Our goals, kind of our principles that we're operating under here, and these are not formal principles, but this is what's come out of the discussions with the rail committee and council and others in the past, is that we're going to build on the work that was done from the prior two rail corridor studies. We're going to set the context at the beginning, which is what the point we're at today, define the problem, and then define the measures of success. We fully expect this process to evolve. We've said this over and over again throughout the spring of this year, that we're not locking ourselves into a process early on, because as we have discussions and as we continually involve the community in this decision-making process, I think we may end up somewhere that we're all not expecting, and we need to be ready to adapt. And then our current process is to use broad-based community workshops, establish commissions and committees and elected bodies for decision-making. We don't currently have a stakeholder group created just for this program. On the top is a flow chart that shows our current decision-making process, which takes somewhere, for each decision would take somewhere around 2 months. And that's being somewhat ambitious. It takes about 4 weeks for us to prepare for a community meeting. The shortest time that we can prepare for PTC and Rail Committee is about 2 weeks, and that's agenda preparation, preparing materials. For more complex decisions, there could be a 2-week period of meeting preparation in advance of that, so it could be up to 4 weeks for each of those committees. Fortunately, we're able to use a lot of the same materials for PTC and Rail Committee. City council agendas are, we start work on those 5 weeks in advance of a city council meeting, so it shouldn't be taken lightly when we add other steps, and we, these decisions are going to take a long time to make. So if we were to add a stakeholder group at the bottom, we're estimating that that would add another 2 weeks, potentially 4 weeks to the process every time we want to make a decision. So that doesn't sound like a lot, but cumulatively, when we make multiple decisions throughout this process, we could be adding months to the decision-making process and the entire alternatives development process. This does not include, we're anticipating if a stakeholder group was convened, it could take 3 to 6 months to get that group up and running, which would put us in a holding pattern for 3 to 6 months. And then you add in the additional weeks that it would take to prepare for the stakeholder group meetings, and we're looking at a several-month pushback of the schedule ultimately. To put that in context, this is a chart that we developed that shows where our peer cities along the peninsula are as far as grade separations, as well as the schedule of Caltrain electrification and high-speed rail. Since the report was prepared, we got more information on Sunnyvale, so I superimposed a green bar there, and the red line represents when Sunnyvale will be complete with their alternatives analysis, and they'll have preferred alternatives selected. Mountain View already has preferred alternatives. They have final design actually for Rengsdorf Avenue, so they're ready to go to construction on that project, and they have a preferred alternative identified for the Castro Street grade crossing. So if we were to push back, and we're currently on schedule, if we continue along the path that we're on, it is ambitious, and we will need to maintain schedule, but we are hoping to have alternatives identified at the same time Sunnyvale has alternatives developed. And this jives very well with VTA's plans to begin work on their implementation study, because then all 3 communities will have a pretty clear picture as to where they are in the process when VTA begins this implementation study, and we'll be on equal footing with Sunnyvale and somewhat equal footing with Mountain View, which is farther along than both Sunnyvale and Palo Alto. We did go to PTC last week, and we made a very similar presentation to them. And at the end of the discussion, they passed a motion that read, Palo Alto will follow a CSS process for evaluation of rail grade separation, including the creation of a dedicated expert stakeholder group in parallel with neighborhood stakeholders. So they did recommend to council that a stakeholder group be convened in order to execute this context-sensitive solutions process. With that, our staff recommendation in regard to this section of the presentation is to review the attached community engagement plan, which is attachment A, and then provide a recommendation to the City Council on the CSS decision-making process.
Okay, thank you. So that's the first part. So I have quite a few public speakers, and since we split this into two topics, if I call your name, if you want to speak to the CSS process, could you come up now? If you want to speak to the objectives, problem statement, criteria, could you wait for the second part of the presentation? What's that?
Both times, if you want to speak about both of them?
Yeah, I guess let me know if you want to speak about both, and I'll keep your card for the second discussion. All right, so the first two speakers I have are Nadia Nayak and Elizabeth Alexis. Do you want to speak on CSS?
Good morning, everyone. So I appreciate Josh's presentation. Thank you, Josh. This slide, which wasn't actually included in our packet, but was sort of an add-on, which is super helpful, I think is missing a lot of decision points. So I think we're getting to what in my public comment described that we need to flesh out the process more, but I don't see the kinds of stuff that you've got a TAC already that's looking at having Caltrain, high-speed rail, water district, all these people being involved. Where are all those decision points in terms of where their feedback is? So I think what's important to lay out here for people to understand the process and not, feel blindsided is that it doesn't matter what you do, stakeholders or not, expanding a TAC or not, you need to lay out these are all the things that we're going to discuss. This is how we're going to input those people. These are the ones that are making decisions. When does the City Council make a decision? When is PTC making a decision? You guys asked last time that PTC reviews stuff. What exactly is their role, right? What exactly is going to be the tax role? And how is the community input? Is there going to be an actual decision from the community at these large community meetings? In the end, are you going to do thumbs up, thumbs down on do we even look at taking people's homes or not? Do we look at a trench or not? I mean, those things, those important decision points that are kind of the tree diagram of alternatives that you guys are looking for need to be fleshed out in order for this to make sense. Otherwise, you're really not spelling out the process. You're going through some of the motions. You've got some great terminology going. We're not quite there yet. So I would just say that that's something you guys need to look at. And I'd like to speak again on the other topic as well. Thank you.
I am going to start using a timer because we have so many speakers.
Okay. Oh, I see. I won't take that personally. So first, I want to Nadia sent a letter yesterday that was kind of, if you're going to go ahead and have a technical advisory committee, one way to kind of split the baby, just add some people, members of the community there, and do the matrix to see that we have different expertise covered, different neighborhoods covered. I mean, especially if you're going to have all council members or PTC members who live near a crossing, not there. I mean, it's absolutely essential to have people who actually understand those places as part of that process. The second thing is CSS is this sort of complete transparency thing. So any technical advisory committee meeting should be open to the public. I mean, people should be able to go to whatever they want. I mean, this is in addition to the big public meetings. I mean, you'd rather people be bored than feel left out, even if there's nothing actually exciting happening in the room. Just back to this idea on the decision making. So we keep talking about this idea that you have to start with this giant list, which you amend and keep sort of alive assumptions, presumptions, and requirements. And there's an additional feature to that, which is really the decisions to be made. And the decisions to be made are not just community ones, like are we comfortable with eminent domain, or do we want to do all of them, or whatever else, right? But there are other ones that, one of the things that drove the high cost of the trench was this thought that you had to have a 24.5-foot clearance for Caltrain, which you may or may not really need to have. That you needed to have an additional 8-foot clearance under a creek for VTA, or the Valley Water, which I'm not sure if you actually need that much. There are other agencies which actually would be the deciders on some critical assumptions that drive costs. So you really have to have this list of all the different decisions, and this is a list that lives. And who makes those decisions? So even a technical advisory committee, I mean, we were talking about who does it really report to? Is it staff or and we're like, no, it's not any one person. For each decision that's being made, it reports to that decision maker. So that's part of this, and that just needs to be explicit. I mean, we should be having at the back of these 333-page reports. I mean, we could really go for 600 pages. No, but there should be an ongoing list of assumptions, presumptions, requirements, where we keep moving things up and down, as well as the decisions to be made and who's going to make them and when do they need to be made. Are these decisions that need to be made sooner or later? Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Roland LeBrun. Did you want to speak to this process?
No, I don't want to speak on CSS. I want to speak on what Josh talked about just now, about what's going on and how it relates to you and how to address the issues with the FPPC.
The recusal issue? Mm-hmm. Okay.
So the FPPC is serious business. I don't know if you know Roseanne Faust. She's been there twice. Second time around, she got a $5,000 fine. The chairman of the Caltrain board right now is a council member in Redwood City. He's currently under investigation. He's about to get another investigation because of his interest in a building on Townsend Street, which is less than 400 feet from 4th and King Station and directly in the path of the Caltrain downtown extension. So now I want to talk about Mountain View and Sunnyvale and then how that relates to you and come up with some solutions. So in Mountain View, essentially what they're doing, they're closing Castro and Moffett. That's essentially like you here if you were to close university at the station. Okay, it's a serious business. But this great separation is really part of building another station. I mean, a massive station aeroplane. My proposal over there is to have the VTA on one side of Castro and Moffett, and then the big quarter-mile platforms will be on the other side. And one of the council members has to recuse himself because he's got a nice Palo, which is less than 500 feet away from that. So I'll come back to that, to Palo Alto in a minute. In Sunnyvale, they're grade separating Mary, which is like your 3 grade separations, and they're also going to grade separate Sunnyvale. That, again, is going to be part of this big, let's do a station, let's have this massive concourse for bikes and peds and whatever. So moving on to Palo Alto. Alma, as you said, is a completely different animal. And as I mentioned during public comment, if you are going to go ahead and have these massive bullet stations, at that point in time, Alma now becomes part of basically the redesign of Palo Alto and potentially what you're doing with your ped underpass and everything else. And the other 3 are going to be a lot more like Mary. Now, the key in Sunnyvale is that you've got to go to the website, see what they're doing. It really is first class. They had their first presentation on Mary. They're showing 8 different alternatives, which are totally focused on adjacent property impacts, and you can tell right at the end which one they're going to go for. It's called the jug handle. It's really creative. And then they're going to have a complete separate discussion about Sunnyvale next week. So my advice to you is watch what they're doing, because I think they're on the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker is Richard Brand. Did you want to speak to this topic?
Yes.
Do you want to speak to the other topic as well?
I'll defer because I haven't seen the presentation yet, but because it had to be broken up this way, and that's unfortunate. So, yes, I'll hold that open, but I will try to be brief. A couple things. I did consult with at least one PTC committee member who asked me some questions about this. That member knew that I was attending the rail committee meetings and involved in this process, and so I supported the idea. Having been a stakeholder, and still am, I guess, in these committee meetings, what I find, and I'm looking at this timeline here, is that a stakeholder group will actually truncate or shorten the work of the staff. And in fact, that's one of the values. I know this is a push-pull kind of question, but with the RPP, we found that we were able to come up with a lot of ideas that could then be put in, and staff didn't have to come up and review that. So I think this 2.5 months versus 2 months can be shortened, because this is a continuum here that will truncate that 6 weeks into less time. So I would argue that this may not be the case in terms of the time, and time is of the essence here, no doubt. The other thing is that I support Nadia's letter that if we should have just one group, and attack should include local residents as stakeholders as well. So I think that one group could work out together, although looking at the TAC list, it's a long list already. I think the list needs to be culled and reviewed in order to make this an efficient process, so that this can be cut down from 6 weeks to less than 6 weeks. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Herb Borak.
Thank you, Chair Du Bois, and good morning, committee members. I want to speak on both parts of this, and since context-sensitive solutions is a process type question, I want to just add reminders, which I'm sure you all know, but it doesn't hurt to put on the record on the conflict of interest, that whatever portion someone is not participating in, it means you can't be at the table that the committee members and staff are sitting on during that conflicted matter, and that definitive decisions about participation can only be in written response from the Fair Political Practices Commission to a request, and elected officials and staff frequently get their own independent counsel to help them frame the question. On context-sensitive solutions, Josh Mello gave a very useful distinction between the old way of doing things and context-sensitive solution, which is a new way. But one way to continue doing it the old way is just to label it context-sensitive solutions. And when you have that situation, very often proponents of context-sensitive solutions fall into the trap feeling they have to bargain with the other position. And if they get some parts of it that looks like context-sensitive solutions, they're willing to call it that. And my advice to the public who know more about context-sensitive solutions than I do, if something is not context-sensitive solutions, but is rather something resulting in a bargain with the old way, it's still not context-sensitive solutions, and people should still be advocating for that and labeling the process for what it is. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last speaker is Adina Levin.
Take the comment on the second half.
Great, thank you. All right, so come back to the committee. Anybody have any questions, comments? Eric?
Did Mountain View have a separate stakeholder committee and a separate technical committee?
I'm not sure. I can check on that for you. I would like to address, if I could, a couple of the comments, the public comments. The TAC is not shown on this because the TAC will not be making decisions. The TAC will be advising the community and PTC and Rail Committee and Council as decisions are made. We're not intending to allow other agencies to make decisions on our behalf around different alternatives, but their knowledge will be important, so that's why they're not shown on this. And just another point of clarification, this is not intended to show the alternatives analysis, the context-sensitive solutions alternatives analysis process. This is only showing how we're intending to make each decision in that process along the way. So it's not actually showing the decisions that will be made, it's showing the process that will be used to make those decisions.
All right, go ahead. Greg.
So in terms of the process and making the decisions, when I look back at what we've done in the past and where we're going, the big issue that came to council was that when we looked at the different, options, we obviously had an option for south of Oregon for a trench, which is only south of Oregon, that came up. Then you had the crossing at Meadow. And at the time, people talked about taking 29 homes fully and 8 partially at Meadow and Charleston together. And at property acquisition, if you maintain the turns off Alma, 32 full homes and 7 partial. Those are a big number of homes. And I think that's one of the reasons, and there are other reasons as well, why the trench was such an attractive option. And so it seems that one of the things, until we know if the trench is a constrained option that we can do or not, it's really hard to figure out how decisions are going to be made. I mean, it seems, are we going to, as we go through this process, how are we going to get to that decision point of, do we want to do a trench or not? I mean, it seems to me, and we don't know yet, because we haven't gone through the process, but the community would prefer to have a trench. At least that's what was in our council voted, that was the preferred alternative. That's the feedback we've always gotten, that the trench is the preferred alternative. And that, with the trench, it was unclear to me if there are no homes taken or if it's just the smallest number, but I think there was some hope that there was no homes taken with the trench. So it seems that the trench is going to be something that everyone wants to know how much it costs, whether or not it's feasible, and it's going to be impossible to make any other decisions until we have the information on the trench. And so when I look at the schedule, what I see happening is, unless we understand the trench, and the trench is complicated. I mean, I think as both members of the public have mentioned, I mean, we have to have decisions about, can you do a 2% grade? Can you, first of all, are they even going to allow us to do a trench? They may simply say we're not allowed to do that. They're not going to let us do that. So there's all this agency cooperation. There's all these understanding what permits are going to be required, how we go through that process. I think there's going to be a significant amount of time spent on that. So when you create this Palo Alto process to come out, in the middle of, I guess it's up to the last quarter of 2018 for a decision, what are your thoughts on that? How are we planning on dealing with that?
So the process that we're currently planning to follow is beginning September 16th, starting to develop what's called a universe of alternatives. So we would, consult with the community, let them put their ideas down on paper. What are the ideas that you've had around these 4 grade separations, grade crossings? Get some ideas on potential solutions, and I fully expect the trench will be one of those solutions that's identified. Then we will go in and, generate all the technical data that's required to evaluate each of those alternatives. So the cost will be one of those components. And of course, we're only going to be able to estimate at a very high level what the cost is until we start moving into engineering. But we'll get an apples to apples comparison of the different alternatives. And then we will reconvene the community, present the universe of alternatives, and start to use our evaluation criteria to narrow those down. And the narrowing down will be a decision point that we'll need to go through our decision-making process to pick the ones that we'll study a little deeper. And then eventually we'll, get down to one preferred alternative. We may end up prioritizing the grade separations. We may end up deciding that we only want to identify preferred alternatives for 3 out of the 4. And the red line that's shown on that chart is when we adopt a preferred alternative. So that's, after we adopt a preferred alternative, that's the point where we start moving into design and we get a much better handle on cost. But we're hoping to have, a pretty good understanding of the cost of the different alternatives by the end of this year.
So I don't think anyone was happy with the way our bridge went over 101. So this reminds me a little bit of the bridge. So how do we get out of the bridge trap? It goes something like this. We say, we're going to build a bridge over Highway 101, a bicycle and pedestrian bridge. We decide, let's build a beautiful bridge. Let's have community engagement. Let's have a design competition. We get all these people involved. We have a design competition, and we choose a beautiful bridge. We go through that process. We then look at the costs, and we're like, that doesn't work. And now we have an unattractive bridge. It's not terrible, but and the process for choosing the other bridge was really just chosen on cost. And we went through all this community engagement, built up all these expectations, and then didn't deliver. And I don't think we're paying enough attention to the fact we're pretending that the trench is not the preferred alternative, that the community may choose something else. I think that's a very low probability. And without constraining it and saying, without having the information in a good way, how are you going to tell the community that the trench works or doesn't work? And once we go down the path that, yes, we think the trench is going to work, but there are all these issues, how are you going to make that decision? How are we going to get there? That's my concern, is I don't want us to spend all the time and then get to the end of it and say, oh, actually the trench doesn't work. And then we spent, 18 months designing, going through it, and not having the feedback. How do we get that? And it could be complicated. It seems like the issue on the 2% versus the 1% is itself a negotiation that's not resolved in a month, that's not resolved in 2 months. And then I guess the other questions is the cost. So, if I'm wrong, but my recollection on the Cal Ave garage was we were at like $10 million to start with, something like that. Now we're $30 million. And so when you say high-level cost estimate, I panic. Say to myself, a high-level cost estimate, what does that, what value does that have in making a choice if we're going to not have numbers that actually we can then go ahead and fund? So
Greg, I agree with this conversation. I totally agree with what you're saying. I'm just wondering if you're not getting into the next section versus the CSS process discussion.
So I was actually talking about the schedule, because that's what was in front, but that's the process on the CSS. And so what I'm really asking is, my concern that I have here is that we act as if CSS says everything is on the table and there are no constraints. Well, there are clearly constraints, and you want to start with a rational set of constraints that the community can work within. And if you say that that's not true, I think we could very much end up like the bridge. And so that's why I'm trying to figure out how we do the process and the schedule, and if we're actually being realistic. That's my concern.
Yeah, so I don't think you've actually bled over into this other area. I think the mayor's, as I hear it, this is a little more theoretical or conceptual, which is saying how we're thinking about how we design this process really has some real life impacts on schedule and what we do, and we need to be thinking about that. If I could just add something to this, could you put, you've got it back up there, good. You've got the schedule back up there. I think this is really important, because if you look at this right now, this is saying that vertical dotted red line looks like the end of the first quarter 2018, which is basically saying we've got to, at a minimum, kind of catch up and be ready in whatever that is, 8, 9 months. And I agree with Nadia's comment that we need to flesh out the steps and the process more, but I think it's really important to think about setting what we think is when we've got to be ready and then reverse engineering back from that, as opposed to a little bit what I heard the mayor potentially saying, we could vaguely also design a process that anticipates some things but then unfolds or balloons way out of our control, and we lose our opportunity. So I think you need to really think about that. And if I could add one other framework for thinking about this, I mentioned this to Tom when we were having breakfast. I think we need to get clear about what it's going to take to ultimately get to making a decision. And I think the language we need needs to be accurate. I mean, unless I'm really missing something, the real decision makers in this is ultimately the city council. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't some exterior decision makers who are going to make determinations on 1% versus 2% or those kinds of questions. But the real question ultimately is that we're going to engage, we're going to inform, we're going to get recommendations from through different approaches. But there's no confusion. At the end of the day, the City Council, informed by the Rail Committee, is going to have to make the choices and the decisions, the official positions on behalf of the city. Now, ultimately, if that means we've got to pursue gap funding that requires, say, a vote of the people, then in that sense, our public ultimately is going to be a decision maker explicitly. But I don't think we can forget the fact that at the end of the day, this has all got to come back to the City Council. You've got to make some decision, and that seems to me that by the end of the first quarter, at a minimum, 2018, we've got to get to that point. And so I would like us to think about this framework that includes some things that have to unfold in parallel in some ways, even if some components occur later. Number one, there is a technical issue here, which is what is the design, what are the impacts of actually what we do at these locations. The second one is what is politically feasible. In other words, what is ultimately acceptable to our community. And the third one is what is financially possible? What is the financial capacity that we have to have? And I think we need to be clear about what we're in the process discussions, what we are designing to. Because in the end, what is politically feasible or has community acceptance, the City Council is ultimately going to have to listen enough and weighed all of that and said, this is where we see this. This can't be delegated to anybody else. You want to be informed by it. But I think that means that we need to be thinking about multiple engagement opportunities. We don't have, for example, focus groups on here. And it very well may be, for example, that you would say in this 8 or 9 month period as some recommendations advance, you will really want to test our community and our public in some very specific practice ways to be able to then, again, inform reactions to folks. So I think those three things, technical, political, community, and financial, need to be kept in mind, and clearly we can't do those in an expressly linear, let's do the technical, then let's see what happens at the decision-making process, then let's figure out how much it's going to cost, because it's not going to work. So please keep that in mind. Thanks.
Okay. Adrian, do you have any comments?
I have a few. So thank you, Josh, for mentioning that one timeline was not the ultimate public-facing timeline. Although I think it is a point well made that we do need a better map of this process. Even this one's a little hard to see, but the one behind. This one certainly, yeah. I just wonder if there's something that could be a little more public-facing for folks, so they do understand this. And then to Nadia's point about where the TAC fits in as well. I mean, this does document it. So just to be absolutely clear, the TAC is public, right?
Yeah, those meetings would be open to the public.
Okay, great. I mean, I have some questions around the timeline, but I think our question here is more about what process we want, how many groups we want involved, what value they add, how they funnel into each other. And then, as the city manager was just mentioning, what are kind of the contours of the decisions they're making. I guess I'm looking to you three. What kind of solutions are we going to propose here? I'm not sold on anything, so.
I mean, I'm supporting the staff proposal, and I think we should add focus groups to it, frankly. I think that may be a good approach, but I think we have to be flexible on it. And I'm open to.
I just want to hear from you all.
Yeah, there's still some questions
Yeah.
too, if you're finished.
Yeah, I think I'm finished for now.
So on that timeline, you said Sunnyvale has to go through design. How long does design typically take? I mean,
If you look at this chart, you can see Burlingame took a year and a half to complete design for Broadway. well, will take a year and a half. San Mateo took, it looks like, a year and a half as well for the design at 25th and Hillsdale.
Okay, so, I mean, it does feel like we're definitely on track in terms of timing. If it takes a year and a half for Sunnyvale to complete their design, and we're kind of right along there, it does make me feel better, and I guess the conversations with VTA about funding this cooperatively instead of competitively. That slide you had on time for decision or recommendation, if council's going to be the decider, I think that what's missing here is assessment of the quality of the decisions. And I've said it multiple times in this meeting that my fear is that in a rush for timeliness, we have a decision the community doesn't accept, and we ended up with a restart and taking a much longer time. Which, again, that's the way the comp plan started, was with workshops, and then we had a reset. So I just want to make that point.
If I could address that, what's not shown here is there would be a fifth piece, which is going back to the community after the council. That's what we're doing with the
Right.
problem statement, the objectives, and the evaluation criteria. That's going to council August 28th, and then the first part of the September 16th public meeting will be reviewing the council
Yeah.
decision, getting opinions on that, and then we move into the next decision.
Yeah, I think we just want a process that surfaces quality decisions. So we have this PTC input that we should have some kind of deeper engagement. I appreciate the city manager's comments on kind of these three areas, because that's what I've been struggling with. I feel we've been somewhat linear so far. And to Councilmember Mayor Sharf's comments about, is the trench feasible, what's the cost? Part of that is, what is our funding capability? Again, I think we need to start to work on some of these in parallel and really having a more clearly defined process, focusing on these areas of, the engineering aspects, the community acceptance aspects, and, we're going to get into the next section, but, projects that are realistic with the amount of funding we expect. But right now, I don't really have a good view of how much funding we could expect beyond Measure B. And then Nadia's point about, we're kind of at a high level defining roles, but we need to, I think, get a lot more specific. And I did appreciate the card letter. I thought it was very well written. And the detail in here, the example of this highway project where they had the criteria for membership, kind of detailed outline of roles, responsibilities, criteria. We're getting there, but I think some of that, a real focus on some of that work right now is going to get us on a much stronger footing kind of going forward. So I am kind of intrigued about the idea of just adding some additional stakeholders to the TAC. I think that's kind of the biggest gap is we are doing these community meetings. Focus groups are pretty qualitative, but really having some ongoing engagement at a deeper level with a few more stakeholder parties, residents. I don't think we have PAUSD on the TAC right now. It just seems like we're missing a few groups, and having those additional viewpoints feed into the recommendations. Hopefully it's not going to add any more time, and we're going to get a much richer set of what the community is willing to accept built into the recommendation. I think the other thing I wanted to say was I actually appreciated making it explicit about building on the prior work. I thought there was a pretty good letter from former Mayor Nancy Shepard about feeling like we were ignoring the previous work, and I think I heard some of that at the first community meeting as well. And a lot of the people that were involved in those earlier works are attending these meetings, so I think it's critical that we acknowledge that work and how we're building on it. Part of that is the community has said multiple times that a trench is preferred. And so, again, I think as we frame this process, when we start a meeting talking about 4 separate separations, it doesn't really allow for that other approach to be discussed. I think we need to think about how that is made more explicit. And then, again, my notes are a little bit out of order, but I keep coming back to the funding investigation and the example of the San Gabriel thing. Almost feels like a parallel track of people focused on the funding. The last thing I'd like to say is I do think constraints are a key part of CSS, and they need to be defined up front. And again, it gets back to this documentation of process and rules. I think constraints is a key part of that. Funding is part of it. And where CSS is strong, I think you bring in these community-based constraints. And just an example, but I'm sure there are tons of others that we aren't even aware of. But, yesterday, the Alma Oregon Expressway intersection was like completely backed up onto Alma. It was very dangerous. We're talking about grade separations, but it hasn't been explicit talking about the Alma Oregon intersection. And those kinds of things would be surfaced, I think, with more community involvement in the process. And hopefully it'll be surfaced in the circulation study too. So again, I would support kind of the recommendation from CARD that we consider adding a few more people to the TAC as recommenders into the process. I think it's a good way to get deeper community engagement without setting up a totally separate committee and a separate, group. So,
can we look at that committee? I mean, I actually I'm fine with adding some people to the committee. I think that actually makes some sense. Though I think you want a workable committee, and you don't want it to be too big. So I mean, I definitely agree. I mean, but I don't think we should be adding 10 community people. I mean, I think we want people with technical expertise from the community. But I'm open to what we do. But I remember there just being a long list.
I think so. It's in your handout here.
It is right. It's somewhere.
It's page 3 of the
CARD letter.
Of the CARD letter. And again, I think some people could fill multiple roles.
No, that's what I was thinking. Right.
So a better list to look at would be in the community engagement plan, which is attachment A.
Okay.
It's on page 9 of that.
Do you also list potential public members?
No, for the current makeup, it's identified on page 9
Well, I think
of
this
the.
list has all of that plus some suggestions.
I have not seen that list, so I can't verify whether that matches the list that's on page 9 of the attachment A.
Page 9, attachment A of the community engagement. Got it.
Okay. The one that says the Caltrain list at the top, and then the community engagement plan identifies.
That's from the CARD letter.
Yeah.
The list that staff provided is attachment A, page 9.
Yeah. So again,
So it's packet page 74.
Yeah.
Yeah, I got it.
So again, I think the CARD letter actually copies all of those, and then it has kind of a working list of potentially others.
So could I make a
Yes.
comment here, like a real world comment? No, I mean I think the tendency to get into the beautiful mind solution that just ties everything together is a little risky. I mean, I actually like the idea of thinking about adding some folks to the TAC. I do think we need to get clear about even the TAC's role, because there are lots of important conversations that have to take place with other peer agencies that some may benefit from being really open and public. I'm sorry, some may be debilitated by that. I know we think that everybody wants to listen to us in Palo Alto, but other folks don't necessarily see that. I can guarantee you that if we did every conversation we did on the San Francisco Creek and the JPA project on getting that project built, we would still not have some things done, because we've got to be able to get together with some other jurisdictions at times and have some big arguments without it all being out there. Now, that's not, no decisions are being made. Those are agreements trying to be reached. And I think we need to think about how we're nimble enough to have these different technical folks, maybe there's plenary sessions at times, but then there's some breakout opportunities for us to mix and match in some way in order to be able to be most effective. So just a caution.
Yeah, so.
Like, the city manager is very eloquent about this, and I'm going to be less eloquent, right? Which is, usually when you do these things, okay, you got sort of two broad level objectives. One is, how do we get the right answer, right? And the other is, how do we make sure there's buy-in from all the stakeholders, okay? Because, right? And the challenge here is going to be, in a perfect world, you'd have everybody represented on all the committees, right? And you would get to the right answer too. And there's going to be a trade-off in here, right? That is, we're not going to be able to get a lot of stuff done with like 30 people on the committee or 40 people on the committee, right? And every group. So I think we're going to have to be judicious about who's represented for the sort of get buy-in versus get the right answer part. And I think, as the city manager pointed out earlier, absolutely correctly, ultimately the responsibility is with the city council to make the right decision. And I think we should weigh very, very heavily on what it's going to take to get us to the right decision and the parameters of, what's technically possible, are we going to be able to afford it, and what's acceptable to the community, right? I mean, that's sort of the right kind of stuff. And so I don't think we're going to be able to represent everybody who's interested on the committee. In fact, we're going to have to make a trade-off for how do we focus on getting the right answer, okay? And because the best thing we can possibly do to get everybody to accept it is get the right answer in the first place, okay? And it's going to be a lot easier too. I mean, I think defend is the wrong word. I think people will buy in. And I think, we're in a situation where I don't think this is going to be the most divisive issue in our community has ever faced, okay? I mean, we have issues in our community. There are really people that really feel one way and people feel vastly different that we try to bridge. This one, the general high-level problem, I think you're going to get most of the community to buy into, which is, increasing congestion on the rail and impact on we want to, without, I don't want to veer into the second part of this discussion, but I think we're going to find that most people sort of have similar values on this kind of stuff, right? So who do we need on the committee to get the right answer? And let's try to not grow it too much longer than that. And I'll say, for example, I'm just going to make this up, right? So don't show me, but the water district, right? Yes. Okay. Is the water district relevant? Yes. Is the water district, where they fall on the trade-off of if we make the committee too big, we're not going to get to the right answer versus everybody gets represented. And I think we got to be very judicious on that.
So if I could just chime in, the TAC is currently intended to be on an as-needed basis. So, as we move through the decision-making process that's shown, we'll reach points where we need to cross the creek, and we'll need to consult with the water district and say, is this something you guys could work with? Do you see any red flags? It's not currently intended to be a regularly scheduled meeting. It would be convened at key decision points where we need technical questions addressed from the different stakeholders.
So you guys some concentric circles on the TAC.
Yeah, just some thoughts again. I think, having the TAC does not stop you guys from having staff with Caltrain staff and these kind of meetings that the city manager was talking about. I think those are going to have to happen. High-speed rail authorities on here, right? I mean, we only have, 7 groups confirmed. We have several invited. The TAC is not that large right now. And I don't think nobody's talking about the extreme of representing everyone. Right. I mean, that's kind of an extreme. I do think just adding a few would make it a much richer group, and I do think it maybe needs to be on a regular schedule, again, for public participation, transparency, and also just scheduling some of these groups. But looking at these lists, I could see adding, maybe a neighborhood rep near each crossing. Again, I think PA, USD, we should invite them. Maybe the research park. I mean, we have business representation through the TMA, but maybe another, like you said, like the Stanford Research Park or another business representative. And then the other one I thought that's interesting on here is a hydrologist, just because the water issues keep coming up, and you do have the water district. but that's like 4 or 5 plus the 7. And I don't expect even the people currently listed on TAC. I don't know if we'd expect them to show up for every meeting, right? So that's just my kind of thought.
So I think that we need to, I'm fine with adding some people to the TAC, but I think we can't lose sight of the purpose of the TAC is a technical advisory committee. And you may also need the ability to create subcommittees, if you want to. You also, I'm not necessarily comfortable with the notion that we should have to have meetings if they don't need to have the meetings. They've already committed to making them open to the public, which I think is a good thing. But I don't want to basically turn the TAC into the stakeholder group. What I want to do is add some additional representation so that if there are technical issues that people think, that, why didn't you consider this? That's really what I view the neighborhood people saying. What about this technical issue over here? How would that work out so that comes forward?
Right. How do you get to the right answer? Not make sure every stakeholder is equally represented.
Correct. And people that have technical expertise and are also in the neighborhoods. I just be honest. Someone like Nadia, for instance, I think has that combination of being in the neighborhood and having technical expertise. And so I'm interested in adding like 3 people. That's what I was thinking. Maybe 4, but not more than that.
Well, I think maybe staff has heard our input, and rather than be that explicit, we could have a more general motion to have the staff, come back with a suggestion for adding deeper community input to the TAC and what the roles and responsibilities would be, and even when they would meet, when they would not meet. I would be.
Yeah, well, just a second on that, Josh. So going back to Nadia's comments earlier about fleshing out the process, and I just think we need to be doing that here just a little bit so we have enough direction. So, I really appreciate the attempt to sort of morph some of these streams together. But what is the reason for adding, say, our local citizen voice to the TAC? Is it technical, or is it political community, or is it both? I think we need to get clear about that because, again, to the mayor's point, I think clearly we'd have to have some freedom to spin off subcommittees because, I guarantee you a lot of other agencies outside us are not going to always want to go to a meeting with us, with our citizens, nothing against them. Then they're going to say, well, wait, I guess we better bring our citizens in too, and then all of a sudden it's a whole different meeting. We just need to remember that other agencies and jurisdictions see the world differently than we do. So what are we trying to accomplish? Is it mostly technical? Or is it representational of the community? And it sounds like at a minimum, if anyone we want to provide the representational piece also has to be somehow technically proficient. That is what we are saying. Okay? All right.
For me, it's not really technical or community. It's a deeper expert engagement through the process versus just a workshop. So it is community members who maybe are more technical, but I think the TAC should also be more CSS, and that it's not purely engineering type decisions. It is engineering married with some community context.
So could I provide an alternative? It's one that I brought up months ago, and you probably hate it. But isn't the rail committee really important? Isn't ultimately you are the nexus between the council and the decisions they make, and you're going to ultimately try to formulate whatever it is, 2 recommendations that the council make, because the rail committee can't even make decisive decisions on its own. Isn't there some way to think about, is there some more direct connection to the rail committee rather than the technical advisory committee. You're going to have to get this. I mean, I'm not saying this is the right thing. Do you have some ex officio members of the rail committee from the community somehow involved? Not the same vote, but advise, I don't know, or some.
We do. They're sitting in the audience.
I know.
Right
Well, now we deputize them.
I don't want to expand the rail committee. I think that's too complicated.
So,
and again, I don't think that gives us necessarily the expertise in the different areas that are potentially missing right now.
So I think we need to define those expertise a little bit if we're going to come back with some recommendations. And then again, I think the TAC needs to be thought of as kind of not static. It kind of expands, morphs, moves, grows, has a subcommittee as needed. Do you know what I mean? Because there you go. Okay.
I mean, I don't view the TAC as the stakeholder group. What I viewed the TAC is it provides an ability for the city to get technical questions answered. And I actually thought if we added some community members, what it allows is there's some community people who can say, why didn't you think of this? That's all. And that they can then get those questions answered. But, the community people come here and ask us, make sure to ask the technical questions and that process. So, I think it's a tough call. I think staff needs to be really clear with us that we're not going to mess the TAC up. And yes, there's no way, for instance, that, if you're going to make progress with VTA on stuff, a lot of those discussions about what we want in negotiations are not going to be made in a public forum. VTA is not going to be open to being, shall we say, have a bunch of our citizens yell at them and say, this is what we want. That's not the way it's practically going to occur. And I think we have to keep that in mind.
If I could perhaps chime on, add on to that, from the perspective, and maybe in the dynamic here from staff, I'll play the engineer here, and someone who's spent a career dealing with other agencies on projects like this. I think in terms of motivation, one of the things to remember in terms of the other agencies' participation with us as we go forward is that they're here by choice, or they will be here and engaging by choice, and the typical bureaucratic response to a situation that they're not entirely comfortable with will, one, be to either not show up, which is really possible in terms of the TAC committees, or more likely will delegate it to junior staff that will not be able to really contribute at the level that we need in order to have effective input into the decision making. So that group dynamic is one to keep in mind, especially if you take as perhaps a given that to a certain extent a VTA, a Caltrain, a high-speed rail, institutional interest is not necessarily to help Palo Alto define the grade separations. In fact, it could be to just go along for the process rather than necessarily see an immediate solution come out of that. So I think that dynamic is really important. And perhaps to Councilmember Philseth's point, the right decision, the term I might use in terms of going from the technical to ultimately the political decision is a sustainable one, a sustainable decision, one that the technicians, the engineers will say, that's the right answer, but then that comes to the rail committee, much less to the council, and the committee and the council say, wrong answer, go back and figure it out. Ultimately, I think staff is looking for a decision that can be made at a staff level that will be sustained through a policy process and that involves a more deliberative discussion that obviously goes way beyond the engineering considerations, but so one that can be carried forward. I think, quite frankly, weighing down the technical discussions too much will ensure that, as I said, you're not going to get the really honest feedback from the other agencies that will help make a decision that will both be sustainable as well as actionable at the council. So I think there's some conflicting goals there. To a certain extent, I suspect that with identifying the right people in the technical, give staff some flexibility for how that interaction actually happens, and would be able to help bring that forward with the recognition of the issues that are important to the council along the way.
So what decision do you need us to make today under this item? I mean, do you want to just endorse the staff plan plus anything else? I mean, is that what you're looking for? I mean, or are you looking for just a discussion, or what? I mean, how do we bring this item to a conclusion?
Yeah, so number one, I mean, we need some direction from you so we can start to move ahead, right? Two, we for the most part, what we're really talking about is what sort of local citizen involvement we're going to have, you know, and to inject formally into our process right now. What I'm hearing is that you want us to look at some way to use the TAC as a forum that can allow us to bring some of those perspectives or voices into the process. And the chair suggested that you give us that direction and we go to work and come back on that. Now, I don't think this is just, and Josh is freaking out thinking about, you know, how does he stay on schedule and all the 20 other things, and what does he do on the shuttle? He's got to come back on that, all those things. I think there's a lot of work that we just need to do at our level too, even talking with the city attorney about how we could bring a recommendation forward pretty quickly on how to make this thing work. And I think we would have to diagram and map it out, that there'll be some situations where the TAC is some subset of it and it's just some staff at some levels, you know, and then there's others that we're engaged, and we may be that we use our own citizen advisors to sit down and even on our staff levels or give us feedback or tell us what to do, and then sometimes participate. I mean, I think we could design that if that's what you're interested in. What I'm also hearing is we would formally all be agreeing that we can let go of this concept of this independent stakeholder group.
Correct.
I think we need to be clear about
Right.
that.
That's correct.
The way I saw this is actually a way to avoid the scenario that Ed talked about, okay? Just enough to avoid that scenario, right?
Just so we want to say, we're not in any sort of Star Chamber, Byzantine bureaucrat thing like, gosh, let's keep our citizens out of here. As a matter of fact, to the extent we can ever be even more effective, we will always do that. At the same time, his thing, but we're inviting people to a dinner party here, right, from other places. And, you know, if they really don't like what we're eating or what wine we're serving, they're going to not come. And we just need to be sensitive to that to some extent we really need their input. In other situations, we really need our own community's input to the technical recommendations that we're going to make.
And I just want to say that this whole exercise today and PTC last week is CSS in process. You know, we're talking at length about decision-making and how we're going to do it, and that is one of the core tenets of CSS, is establishing the decision-making process early on. So I just want to commend, you know, everyone for, you know, this is the CSS process in action, and we're experiencing it right now.
Let me just put a schedule thing on. Right now, we're scheduled to come back from the Rail Committee to the council on September 5th in the tentative agenda. So, I mean, and be open to thinking whether or not the Rail Committee's direction would be enough that we could put this together for the item that would go to the council.
I think it is, but.
So I don't think this is what Ed meant, and I appreciate the comments about, you know, engineers and having a dinner party that people want to come to. But I also think we don't want to go back to kind of this old method of the technical decision driving the solution, and we get in this mode of deciding and defending. And, you know, if the TAC makes a decision, you come to the Rail Committee and we don't like it, that's basically the old method. Like, they were going to defend it and we would have to object to it, right, versus a more collaborative approach. So I just don't, I think some public speakers said this too, I don't want to call it CSS if it's not CSS. You know, and so I would like to figure out a way that we could add, like I said, deeper community engagement. Even what the TAC, just being on the TAC doesn't mean if there are like subcommittees that, again, there's an engineering discussion, again, maybe it's open to the public, but it doesn't mean that all participants, I guess, are at the table as that part of that particular discussion. I don't know how we would work that out, but again, the pieces I see missing right now are our neighborhood, schools. We have some business, and then environmental expertise.
So I think that's really important. I just, again, think that, I mean, the TAC itself isn't necessarily how we solve that. I don't think we have ever felt that stakeholder engagement is not central, and representative stakeholder engagement that allows for the political community buy-in on technical decisions. That's what we're after. I don't know that we can specify all of those right now, but we could give more definition to that even when we come back to the council. And even the idea of just some static representatives rather than free-flowing. I mean, we could have hundreds of, forget the group meeting, we could have 200 people involved in a much more hands-on way over the next 8 months than we would even with just, say, one single committee with 10 people on it. You would get more representative voices. Let's just take PAUSD. I can't imagine that we could get them to hang in there with us at the level that we would, but episodically or appropriately engaging them, we can be sure that we do that.
I also wanted to say that I don't view the TAC as making decisions, Tom, on anything.
No.
I view them as purely advisory, frankly advisory to staff, and then staff makes the recommendation to PTC and the rail committees, and then eventually to council. So, I think that's an important point that we've got to keep in mind. And then I think staff needs to be able to use the TAC to get good information, and I think that's what staff's pushing back on. And I think we got to make sure that happens. I also think it's more than the TAC. I think if we're going to give this direction, I also wanted to give direction to go back, and I like the city manager's idea of focus groups. I think some focus groups actually can really get good citizen engagement by going through that process. And then I also, on a third thing, wanted to give direction to staff that we really focus on starting to work out what a trench would look like and the costs associated and the constraints and how that would work, because the sooner we start on that process, the better the information everyone will have. And I view that as the stumbling block in all of this. I think because those technical issues regarding the trench are what delays this process. I don't want to wait for people to say I don't want to go through a whole process where we say that let's get to this point where we then decide the trench is the preferred alternative. I want to do it in parallel. And we may choose the trench as not being the preferred alternative, but I want to take the risk that we spent all that time understanding the trench, because I don't think anyone can make the choice without having the information.
So I might suggest that similar to how we're working on the circulation study in parallel to the context-sensitive solutions alternatives analysis, maybe we start work on a white paper that looks at the trench.
That's all I'm
and
suggesting.
Starts to, take the work of Mott McDonald a little bit further, and we could provide that as information as part of the decision-making process through the CSS.
This is another aside. I mean, I haven't even talked with Josh about this, but not everything just directly has to be in transportation's wheelhouse. So, I mean, I think we're going to do some financial scenario planning, what ifs, under different possibilities, whether it's, how we could look at what the appropriate numbers are, what does it mean on bond financing versus other things. So we start to, again, these are high level, but we start to put some meat on the bone about these things.
He's really only talking about accelerating the existing process, not sort of getting into the decision of Alma Crossing versus.
Chair Du Bois, could I make one comment?
Yes.
So perhaps one tool that would be a component of enriching citizen involvement, which we could talk about offline. It would be legal and permissible for this committee to enhance and loosen and supplement the public participation practices that we usually use. So I know sometimes people feel that public comment is kind of narrow and constraining. And if this committee was interested in enhancing the public dialogue process in this committee, we can talk about ways to do that.
I actually think that would be a great idea. We've done that on some of the airplane noise stuff, and I was actually thinking how engaged people on the airplane noise stuff. I mean, if we scheduled a meeting on airplane noise right now, there'd be 100 people in this room. 200 people in this room. And, And I got to say, we don't have a formal stakeholder group, but the airplane noise people understand that stuff better than the FAA half the time, I think. I mean, it's really amazing the expertise they bring to it. So I'm open to us doing some of that stuff.
So just a few things. I think it would be helpful to potentially expand this group, but I also just want to remind us all, we do have, comment periods at PTC and this meeting every single time, right? So there's that level of community engagement. I'm a little worried about just putting community engagement within the TAC, because it seems like something we're going to turn off when we don't want it, and if we're having other agencies come, we're just going to turn off the public engagement piece there. So that seems a little shallow to me. And then also, I do think, Tom, your comments around finance are well taken. I don't think we have that piece exactly. It could be the trench study you're looking at, but maybe that's separate, done more at the staff level. And then just the last thing, Eric, I think you said it pretty well. We're trying to make the right decision. We're trying to get agreement on it. And I think if we as council push more on getting the right decision, we're taking on more of the political risk on the backside. But I also kind of agree with you that the values around this aren't as fraught as some other issues we face in the city. So I guess we should just be clear with ourselves about that, right?
Okay. I'll attempt a motion. So my motion would be to have staff propose adding some additional members to the TAC, to add additional expertise in areas that aren't represented, to define those roles, responsibilities, and potentially subcommittees, to consider adding focus groups, and to start to develop a trench scenario.
Okay, I'll second that.
Is the trench scenario, it's just the trench itself? Do we want anything on like financial scenarios and directing staff there?
I don't know if that needs to be part of this motion.
Can we actually move that second part, the trench and the finances, to the second item and just deal with the process issues here?
Okay.
And just real clear, I may leave during that part of it in some way, but I'm assuming that the whatever motion comes out of the committee is not prescriptive. I mean, it's trying to clarify some particular directions. But when we write the report to the council, we may touch on some areas that are unspoken, and then the council.
It's not prescriptive.
So do you want me to read that motion again? Did you guys get it? Yep.
We even got the part about accelerating the trench scenario, even though it's really only accelerating the existing process.
Well,
That was good. That's a classic. Let the record note. Thank God.
Well, so I think without any kind of motion, we're going to put together a white paper on the trench. So.
Well, we'll talk about that in the next section. All right, so
okay.
All those in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Aye. Great. All right.
Okay, so I have a hard stop at 11, so hopefully we can wrap this up.
All set for you. All right.
Is there a second one of those? Oh, is it?
We got halfway through.
We got halfway through, that's why I'm.
See her. Okay.
So now we're on item number 2, right?
It's still the same item. It's 2B.
Oh, it's 2B, right, that's right.
So it's still the same item, but we've broken it into 2 parts, and this is the second part, which will cover the problem, the objectives, and the evaluation criteria. And just to give you a background on how we arrived at the problem statement, the objectives, and the evaluation criteria, this process started with 15 community stakeholder interviews, which my staff and I conducted across the street at the downtown library. These interviews included neighborhood leaders, advocates, former elected officials, and local rail experts. The key takeaways from those interviews were that the prior rail corridor studies are important. There's a confusion around the trenching study. A lot of folks misinterpreted the trenching study to be some type of alternatives selection, when in fact it was just a feasibility analysis of what it would take to do a trench. There were also differing opinions on the CSS process, which we're pretty familiar with. Concerns about presupposing solutions. One particular interview, we talked about how the trench could be more expensive than a traditional grade crossing, and there was a disagreement. Folks want us to be very deliberate about how we talk about cost and of each of the different alternatives, and not presuppose that one may be more expensive or less impactful than others. And then we, it was reaffirmed that safety and visual impacts are very important. So visual impacts around the potential to, raise the railroad. There was a lot of concern around the impacts that would have on surrounding neighborhoods. Following the stakeholder interviews, we hosted our community workshop. You're very familiar with what occurred then. That was May 20th. We had 130 attendees, 39 written comments. The afternoon of that Saturday, we talked about the problem definition, objectives, and evaluation criteria. And that was that session is where we got the most valuable input on these three topics. Over the summer, we did a SurveyMonkey community questionnaire. We emailed it out to 444 recipients. That's the number of people that we have on our GovDelivery email list for the Connecting Palo Alto rail program. They sent it out via email trees to their neighborhoods and other groups. We also promoted it on social media. And as a result, we had 791 unique responses within the 2-week period. 98% of those who started the questionnaire completed it. Which is a pretty good completion rate given the complexity of the questions and the amount of information we were asking people for. The purposes of the questionnaire were to maintain community involvement. So you remember one of the key tenets of CSS is continuing engagement. We didn't want to have the May 20th workshop and then disappear for 3 months and leave community members feeling as though we had forgotten about them. We also didn't want to bring anything forward to PTC, Rail Committee, or Council without first going back and checking with the community, as part of the continuing engagement process. So the questionnaire shared the draft problem statement, objectives, and evaluation criteria, and then solicited input from the respondents on those three topics. After the questionnaire, we made some edits to the draft problem statement, and I can read this if you want, but it's included in your packet. This is our suggested problem statement today, and this is how we will frame this process going forward in this program. So instead of staff or someone else deciding what we think the problem is, this is a community-driven problem statement that attempts to clarify how the community sees the current issues out there and what we should use to develop solutions to the problem. We also developed a list of suggested objectives. It's a pretty long and lengthy list, and I'll talk a little bit about PTC's recommendation in a little bit, but we may want to think about shortening this and being more pointed about where we want to focus our efforts on this. And then the evaluation criteria, we have 3 tiers, and the tiers are based on the questionnaire and the input we got during the community workshop. The ones in tier 1 are what the community thought were the most important. Facilitate movement across the corridor for all modes, reduce delay and congestion for automobile traffic at rail crossings, provide clear and safe routes for pedestrians and bicyclists, and support continued rail operations and Caltrain service improvements. That was something that a couple of our interviewees touched on. Is whatever we develop, it should support Caltrain service, not detract from Caltrain service or planned Caltrain service expansions. And then the tier 2 criteria and the tier 3 criteria are still important, but they were judged to be less important than the tier 1 criteria. The PTC last week reviewed these materials, and their two recommendations in regard to this portion of the presentation is to reconsider the inclusion of noise and vibration and other common issues near railroads in the problem statement. They felt that safety and circulation are really the primary issues, and that noise and vibration are something that's fairly common when you live near a rail corridor, and to expect us to solve those problems might be a little bit of a stretch with our rail program. And then their second recommendation was to reduce the number of objectives to the top 4. So this is the current list of objectives, and they felt that like a lot of the ones at the end are just best practices, and we would be doing those anyway, like maximizing Palo Alto's fair share of available funding sources. And they didn't necessarily feel like they were worthwhile putting in the objectives for this program because it dilutes the other, the top 4 objectives, which are to improve safety along the rail corridor, reduce traffic congestion, improve circulation and access for all modes, and then deliver grade separations in a timely manner. So with that, I conclude the presentation.
The evaluation criteria and the suggested objectives, why wouldn't you just have one?
So the objectives are a refinement of the problem statement. I'm sorry, I just got a...
But what's the relationship between the suggested objectives and the evaluation criteria?
So the objectives are a refinement of the problem statement. The evaluation criteria, when we start to develop our alternatives, we'll create an evaluation matrix which will rate each of the alternatives on how they meet the evaluation criteria.
You have specific metrics?
Yes, we'll develop specific metrics on how do we measure reduction of delay. And we'll have a matrix that basically compares all of our alternatives using the evaluation criteria. So the objectives are more policy, the evaluation criteria are technical in nature. And then just next steps, we're going to City Council on September 5th. It's no longer August 28th. We were hoping to convene the Technical Advisory Committee sometime in September just to give them an update on where we are and not string them along too much, bring them into the fold and let them know that we'll be consulting them throughout this process. And then we're hosting a community workshop on September 16th. And then we did pencil in a tentative community workshop on October 21st. But, we've been thinking more about that lately, and we think there could be a potential to use polling and or focus groups in lieu of having a community workshop 3, because that workshop is going to be where we start to talk about what alternatives are acceptable and appealing to the community. So a focus group might be a better way to get more intensive involvement from the community and allow for more prolonged discussion about the pros and cons of different alternatives than a community workshop. And with that, our staff recommendation today in regard to this section of the presentation is to review the attached summary of Community Workshop 1 and the summary of the questionnaire responses, and then provide a recommendation to the City Council on the draft problem statement, project objectives, and evaluation criteria for discussion at Community Workshop 2, and to inform the development and screening of grade separation alternatives.
Okay. All right. We do have some members of the public. All right, so for item 2B, we have Nadia Nyack, followed by Elizabeth Alexis.
Hello again. So I'm kind of actually still mentally on the last section. But when you're looking for better ways to maybe have some of these meetings be a little bit more engaging with the public, some of the things that we did in the last rail committee meetings in the past was that when there was lengthy discussion like you guys just had, they would actually go around for a second round of comments, because oftentimes folks like us are like, oh, but their mistake, So for example, the 2% grade is absolutely a technical thing that Caltrain can do. It's on their tech specs, right? But it leaves the rest of us like biting our fingertips because we've got lots of more things we could say. So that's an easy way to kind of get more engagement. The other thing that was done in previous rail committee iterations was there was a lot more working group sessions. So oftentimes the chair would have different sets of groups who might come up. So you might have Card come and present what we know. You might have Clem Tillier come talk. You might have Adina come talk. But it allows you, council members, in an open forum to ask specific questions and get data. And it presents a way publicly for all of us to also help staff get some of the things that they need. So those would be some suggestions on maybe how to while you guys still figure out where stakeholders belong in this process, how to actually start to have a wider conversation. Because I think what I hear you guys struggling with at its core is that you don't want to make anything too official, but you agree that the citizens have something to add. And in the end, we all just want to have a really good conversation and make sure that we're having it openly. So I think there's a way to figure this stuff out. I will say that I sent my comment in and I warned you not to print because I was thinking of you guys that might be printing it at home and reading them last minute last night. But the packet does not include the rest of my attachment, which be page 10 through 36, which includes excerpts from the Pennsylvania project. They have very specific examples in there of community criteria that they use to kind of measure their alternatives. Obviously, that's a finished report, so it's much more advanced than what we have. But some of the specific things are, for example, if you were looking at the Churchill Crossing, including criteria that would say, really maximizing how to get bikes across or whatever. They just had very geographically specific criteria. So I would highly recommend that we continue to look at models of other projects to see how we can build on those and look at those things. And I think that's all I have for the criteria right now. I just, again, it's going to be hard to continue to whittle that down unless there's a kind of a spelled out process of kind of where we're going with all this stuff. Thank you.
Thank
you. Yes, it would be nice to talk more about I think there are some interesting things that were brought up about what is the role, why do you want normal people in a room with the technical experts? I mean, that's sort of the magic of CSS is you're asking technical people to think a little differently than they do before, because on the technical side, you get sort of stuck on standards, right, and the book and what it says. And what you're asking people to do is, can you think of another way to achieve your objectives? Like if you're trying, for the water district, I mean, it really is a big project, right? We have all the creeks that we're crossing. We have a lot of water flow issues. We have a lot of stuff there. So 10 people going really deep is not the same as 200 people going shallow. I mean, it's different. You want both, actually, because there's certain things that the 200 people will give you feedback on, but 10 people thinking really deeply about the problem. And that leads into the problem statement. I think, and this is one thing to think about with Eric and with some other people. I think you've got a problem statement on sort of a global level, right? That we have the Caltrain and expanded in 2025, and that we've always had limited capacity on an east-west, and that's already taxed, and that will it'll be a non-viable. But then we start to look, and this is where we can use the experience, what we've learned from the previous studies, and why we're a little different than the problems we're looking at in Sunnyvale or Mountain View. I mean, I think you can divide it up. I think there is a South Palo Alto project that starts at San Antonio Road. It includes the station area because one of the things, the 2025 Caltrain thing is not just about the crossings, but it's going to be about, as people who do not work now in San Francisco because it's a pain in the butt to get there, they will work in San Francisco. People who live in Palo Alto, who live in Los Altos, who live and all of these things are going to create a demand to get to the stations, and we need to be thinking about that when we're solving these other problems. We have more issues with bicyclists than other cities do because of our reliance on that for the high schools, where you get, in a half an hour period, you get, 500 people moving across the crossing. They have to be a different kind of width. But I would look at, and as I think staff said, you said, oh, there's just two alternatives. No, there's actually, the permutations and combinations you get, because we know, this is things that we already know, right? It's expensive to maintain all the current turning movements. So the question is, can you find a way, because we do have a couple of crossings, right? And the San Antonio Road we haven't even talked about sort of looking at that area and what that can use or not use, or the limits, what's going to happen there. But looking across those South Palo Alto is a general problem, I think, is one issue. Then looking at sort of north of Oregon Expressway, including the Cal Ave area, because there's issues with just people even getting to the station there, and people getting onto Alma, up to, let's call it, Town and Country. That's one area, because some of the solutions may include looking at the Embarcadero crossing as taking up some capacity. And then the Alma Street one is really, it is a Palo Alto station area plan, which we will need to do. And thinking of those as three different distinct things.
Thank you. Richard Brand.
Richard Brand, resident and I guess acting as ex officio advisor here. Thank you, Mayor Scharf. A couple things on the problem statement. I think, and this comes back to what I outlined at the beginning of the meeting, is that the suggested problem statement, the high-speed rail is going to be probable. I wouldn't say possible. I mean, as it is right now, high-speed rail is a probable solution, and we've heard them say that as they presented here. So right now the wording is possible. Yes, funding is still up in the air, but I think you need to consider changing that. And that brings me to the other issue of the trench, which I think is a great discussion that's going on. I think staff, though, cannot come back with a cost issue until we have high-speed rail tell us what they're going to do about 4 tracks versus 2. 4 tracks will change us, and in fact, what are we going to do? Close down Alma and build a shoe fly along Alma to get the trains to continue to shoe fly as a alternative rail solution. 4-track trench is going to, where are you going to put the tracks? So once again, this all depends, and I'm defending staff here, on what the high-speed rail people do. We need a solution. We need an answer from them on that proposal. Thank you.
Thanks. Next speaker is Herb Borak.
Yeah, I just want to talk a little bit about the problem statement. How you frame the problem statement gets into what Councilmember Filseth said on the previous part of this agenda item, which is making a decision and having buy-in on the decision. At previous meetings, and I guess at this one, it seems that the no project alternative, that is not doing any kind of grade separation, whether it's a trench or cloverleaf or anything else, that's already been made, even though not in a formal way. So in some sense, that's part of the problem statement, that you already decided not to do that. Another part of the problem statement is the relationship to future development. I mean, if Caltrain is the only rail line and is not high-speed rail, just to simplify it, and their ridership is going to double, does that mean that half the people who drive, an equal number of the people who are driving as ride on train now, well, it's just going to come from those people. So we're going to decrease the number of people who are driving cars in Palo Alto by an amount equal to the commuters who come into Palo Alto and the commuters who leave Palo Alto. But if the real situation is related to the comprehensive plan, that land developers and large corporations who among themselves could pay for all this and not have a sales tax and bonds among the public, if they want that relieving that traffic congestion to be able to develop more and have more employees come in by vehicles so that you're back to the same congestion. And what's missing from the problem statement is the land use decisions that are being made in the future when you make your comprehensive plan decisions, and those have to be weaved into that. Otherwise, it just becomes an issue that you've already made a decision, for example, to do a trench, or maybe the problem statement is as stated by the city manager, which is there's this pot of money available within a short period of time, and our problem statement really at the top is how do we do this so quickly and come to a decision that people buy in to get that money. Thank you.
Okay, and our last speaker is Adina Levin.
So a few different points in terms of the problem statement and objectives and criteria is, as well as the process, is that I think funding strategies really needs to be a first-class consideration here, because like if a trench is the preferred alternative, the order of magnitude cost here is $1 billion. And like, think about the heartache about the Adobe Creek Bridge in the $10 to $20 million range, and that was difficult. We're talking 2 orders of magnitude greater than that. $1 billion is a little bit of money. And the strategies, whether they be bonding, whether they be taxing, whether they be land value capture, those will make a really big difference in terms of the burden on community members, the change in the community being envisioned in order to make some of this possible, and building in the time to get the expert advice on the financial options, and then the community input on what seems like desirable strategies and undesirable strategies. I think that needs to be pretty heavily weighted in the analysis and in the decision making. So that's one point. Another point with regard to taking things into the account but not prejudging, you may be familiar with the process that Burlingame went through, where they had a earlier phase and they said, we want a trench. The council members were really persuaded they wanted a trench. The community members were persuaded they wanted a trench. Then they look at the details, and where they came to, they saw visualizations of the amount of fencing you need to protect electric poles and wires from people falling on top of them. And they concluded for themselves that the aesthetic impact, they thought that was uglier than the other alternatives that they were looking at. That was the decision they made. And the other thing is that they looked at the water issues where they were located and realized that it would be extremely difficult at that location to keep it dry. And they came up with, at the end, a split alternative that was different from where they thought they started. I do not have a personal opinion. Friends of Caltrain has no position on this topic. So this is not to say Palo Alto should do one or the other. It's to say that when those options are considered and people look at the visual impacts and the data, they may come to a different place than when they started. Then 2 more things more quickly, if I might. One is about how separable ALMA is, and one of the things that I've heard from community members is around on the permeability topic. It might be possible to make additional through connections in that area, but that would have timing and funding interrelationships, and even in the current value capture legislation, where things don't need to be in the exact same location, they could intertwingle. So I know that has like some consequences that people don't want in terms of the process, but that might be considered sooner rather than later. And just the long middle 3 only goes through CalAv. So that was the question that I asked.
Okay, it's back to us for discussion. So I think there's 2 parts here, right? There's the problem statement, criteria, objectives. And then I think we're also being asked to, well, just to review the results. Yeah, so that's it.
Adrian, you Sure. So I think the problem statement is pretty close. There's a few things I want to change, and I'll start with the small ones. So one, I actually do appreciate Richard's comment about high-speed rail, probable versus possible. Another one that kind of stood out to me is saying the rail corridor also creates issues in surrounding neighborhoods. It also creates issues for Stanford's and for our commercial areas, and I think that's worth noting. Then the last thing, this is kind of the biggest comment. I think it's important for us to frame this problem as something else we're committed to. Because, I mean, we could say, like, gosh, Caltrain's going to, increase service, and we should just fight them tooth and nail and not do grade separations. So I think it is important for us to acknowledge that Caltrain is really the backbone of heavy transit on the peninsula, Many of our residents use it to get to work. Many folks come down here for work. And so I think it's worth acknowledging, Caltrain is expanding. It's going to provide more service to our region and to our city, but there are these connectivity and physical barrier issues. So I would just recommend that we kind of bring that opportunity and benefit of Caltrain to the front and then kind of do the but. That's my comment on the problem statement. I do have comments on the other things, but do you want to
why
just
don't we
stick?
just talk about the problem statement?
I agree.
Just stick to that for now? Okay.
Do you want us to wordsmith this right now? Would that be the easiest thing for you to do, or do you want general comments like Adrian just made?
I mean, so after this meeting, we'll refine it and bring it to council on September 5th. So, I mean, just input into the refinements you'd like to see would be sufficient, I think, as long as there's general agreement.
So I
among
agree
the
with what
committee.
Adrian said. I'm perfectly good with that. I actually think you did a good job on the problem statement. I think the unspoken part of the problem statement, and I know you want to just do the problem statement, but I think it bleeds into this, is when we put down objectives all the way bottom is cost minimize right-of-way acquisition. I'm afraid that we are not talking about that when we look at these grade separations, that it's up to 50 homes that are taken. And I think that if we don't make that explicit as we go through this process, and one of the things may be minimizing eminent domain, whereas when you talk about just right-of-way acquisition, people think it's a cost, and it feels like we're hiding the ball. So I don't think it's appropriate just to use the term right-of-way acquisition. I want us to be explicit so that people talk about it, that the community has this discussion. I don't want to get through this all and then, 50 people whose homes might be taken, plus their neighbors and that, come out, en masse and say, we had no idea this was going on. So I think that's really important. I'm not sure that needs to go in the problem statement, but that is my biggest concern with sort of where we are on this.
If I could, we could certainly change right-of-way acquisition to property acquisition or acquiring property, or something that's more explicit under the objectives. In the evaluation criteria, I know you want to talk about that later, but currently minimized right-of-way acquisition is shown as a Tier 3 criteria, so, a recommendation the committee could make is to move that to Tier 1.
Or 2. But I guess the question is, do we want to explicitly say eminent domain?
I don't know. I just don't want to be ever accused of that we hid the ball. So I wanted to say it publicly, and I don't know how we do it. I just want it to be out there in the public, and people start talking about it.
Yeah, so there's generally two types of property acquisition. There could be voluntary sale to the city, and then there could be eminent domain. And I think the eminent domain one is the primary concern, if I'm reading you correctly.
Correct.
Yes.
So I'm good with the problem statement with comments that Adrian made. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I generally support the comments both of you guys made, and maybe a few tweaks to something that Adrian said. But for me, I feel like we're burying the headline on the problem statement. I think we're really talking about future impacts, and that's really understated. It doesn't come out that that no project is not really feasible because of these future impacts, right? So I think that needs to be kind of the headline. And so, the very last sentence is some of these issues will continue to get worse in the future. I think that's just very weak.
I agree with you, Tom. You're right.
And so I would split the support of Caltrain sentence with the but, and I would actually lead with, the planned increase in frequency and length of trains by Caltrain and high-speed rail will worsen all impacts. And then maybe follow that up with City of Palo Alto benefits from Caltrain service, and we support, Caltrain. But again, just being really clear that why are we spending all this money? It doesn't even sound like there's a big problem here.
If I can just respond to that last comment,
Yeah.
Hillary Gittleman, the planning director, I just wanted to let the make the committee aware that some of the very strong responses we got to the citizen questionnaire was on this subject, and they challenged us to acknowledge that some of the impacts, for example, noise and vibration, may get better with electrification.
And so they didn't want us to lump like all the impacts are going to get worse. They wanted us to be more explicit about our support for Caltrain service and acknowledge while congestion may get worse, other impacts may be improved in the
Yeah, I don't know
future.
how we quantify if they get better if there's maybe a little less noise, but it's much more frequently, right? So again, we're talking about, I think, more trains, potentially longer trains.
Well, it's east-west connectivity that gets worse. Congestion may actually get a lot better because people hopefully are taking Caltrain and not driving.
Well, but the number of times that the gates come down and traffic
That's
gets
east-west
congestion.
connectivity.
Yeah, but the congestion associated with that is
Correct.
what
And we also need to
will
be
get
realistic
worse.
about the volumes. I mean, you're talking 10 times the volume in vehicles and 30,000 people on the train.
I mean, this is why I do think we actually want to lead with the opportunity a little bit, saying, you know, the city of Palo Alto is supporting the modernization of Caltrain, which will result in better service, but that will impact our east-west connectivity, noise, vibrations.
So that's the one thing I disagreed with. In terms of a problem statement,
You think you want to lead with?
we should lead with the problem, right?
I just think people don't. I just think people don't see it yet, and I think you articulated it well. Like there is something coming towards us, and not doing anything is not an option.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is I consider Stanford and businesses to be parts of the neighborhood, so I wasn't really clear what you were suggesting that we say there. But again, that's my main comment, that we should really be very explicit that these changes are coming and they're going to have significant impacts. Do you need anything more explicit than that feedback?
No, I mean, I think we can look at ways to emphasize that more clearly and also emphasize that Caltrain is a good thing for the community in general. The Caltrain service that's provided to Palo Alto and will be provided with electrification.
Great, okay, so let's move on to the objectives. Mix it up or go in the same order?
I'll lead off. I don't mind. So I think these are pretty good. A few of them, per some of the PTC's comments, and what you said, Josh, we maybe could knock off like the bottom one, maximize Palo Alto's fair share of available funding sources. I think we're always going to do that. Minimize disruption during construction. I hope we do that every time, and I think that's kind of, that goes without saying. The one that I didn't see here is kind of, I don't know the exact phrase, but leverage these changes that are happening and kind of coordinate it with our land use planning, other opportunities that may arise, maybe even doing a new station plan, particularly for downtown. I think that there may be an objective there in terms of saying, you know, there are these big changes coming, we're doing this, lots of physical work, lots of upgrades, and what are the surrounding land use station impacts? I think that's all I've got on the objectives for
I'll tell you
that.
what I actually think we should change it to minimize eminent domain and local road closures. I think that would be helpful. I think we should strike to ensure fairness in terms of the investments, improvements in North and South Palo Alto. And let me tell you why. We, as a community, may decide we're going to close Churchill, which would mean a much less investment in North Palo Alto. We may decide we're going to do a trench, which is a much higher investment in South Palo Alto. And I don't think it makes any sense to say the funding needs to be equal for both. And so I think we should strike that.
Okay. Is that it?
Yeah, I also agree with Adrian about getting rid of the last two. So I would get rid of the last three and make that one change. Let me just see something else to make. Yeah, I think the rest of it's fine.
So a lot of agreement on this. It's great. I agree with both of those comments. My main comment was the third bullet. I think improving circulation and access for all modes of transportation, period, is an objective, and that separating bicyclists is a separate objective. And I think in your report you said that this was somewhat in priority order. It's kind of clustered. So I think it might be good to make that explicit in the workshops and things, because it is a long list. I don't necessarily agree that we need to get it down to 4 items, but I think there is some, implied priority in this list. The other thing in the staff report, there's a sensitivity about talking about the trench because we're potentially proposing a scenario. But I think that's in opposition to this kind of recognizing the work of the past. So I think it would be great if you could find a way in the objectives to reference that a past community desire, stated desire, council stated direction has been a trench. But we're starting to look at this new approach just to acknowledge that past work so we don't continue to get feedback that why are you ignoring this work from a few years ago? So I just wouldn't completely drop it. I'd work it in somehow.
Yeah, I'm fine with that as long as, if it seems that the trench is not going to be feasible, I don't want us to be locking in that that's an objective.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's an objective. I'm just
Right,
acknowledging that it was a past
work
preference, right?
I think we could certainly reference the past work and the community preference for the trench and then clarify that we'll be, going through a formal alternatives analysis process. And we may end up there, we may not end up there, but we'll think about how to word that.
But at least that gets us starting on the trench work, and I'm good with that.
Okay.
Just one last piece I'm missing from here. I don't know, again, if this is one that goes without saying, but to support the city and region sustainability goals, there's nothing in here about that. But it's not priority one.
Why would we add that? I mean, I understand, but we're trying to.
I'm just wondering, like, as we've heard about things like, as we've heard about things of, in terms of, one, like there's the mass transit aspect of this. Two, there's also like the bike and ped stuff, right? I agree with you, Tom, that separating bike and ped is not a first order thing.
Well, it's up there. I'm just saying it's not the same.
Right, as improving circulation for all modes. There's the electrification piece. There's kind of our construction management, some of these sensitive areas. There's all the creek work. I don't know. I'm not totally sold on it. It just seems like as I look through this list, that seems to be one key term we're missing, but we may not need it here.
We could potentially expand the one that says to support Caltrain service enhancements to encourage sustainable transportation or something to that effect. Okay.
Okay. All right, keep it moving here. Criteria.
The draft evaluation criteria, right?
Yeah. Why don't we switch up the order? I'll jump in and then we'll go down the line. So I didn't know if we needed to call out rail operations as a tier 1. I don't think anybody's talking about trying to stop Caltrain or anything. It just seemed not needed. That was just an impression. Number 2, I do think minimizing right-of-way acquisition should be at least a tier 2. I'm not sure it should be a tier 1, but a tier 2. And then tier 3, I think we should, separate the other part of that, finance with available funding sources. I think we should have something like, determine funding sources and take steps to start to get them in place. So this was, I think, one of the public speakers said, making the funding strategy more explicit and a class 1 problem.
Yeah.
So if I could just jump in, so just to be clear, these are criteria that will be used to evaluate the different alternatives. So
okay, so
it would have to be.
I guess it would. Well, I guess the other, maybe it doesn't belong here, but the other part on the costs that I forgot to mention is last time in the workshop we threw in a bunch of potentially new crossings, which may have different sources of funding. And I said in the last rail meeting, I think we should be really clear about separation of costs on current grade SEPs from funding potentially new crossings. And I think that adds confusion to the process. But.
So, I think what Tom, maybe we're trying to get a little bit, and I'm struggling with this too on the cost thing, it's really not cost, it's feasibility. It's cost feasibility. I mean, something may be more expensive, and we may choose to do it, but it's feasible, whereas something may be totally unfeasible because of the cost.
And knowing what's feasible requires some analysis of funding sources, but not sure how we capture that.
So maybe finance with feasible funding sources instead of available? Because it may very well be that
That's what I would
they're
say.
not available today.
I would
but
just
they-
say cost feasibility,
Okay.
frankly, and leave it at that. And knowing that just like you're going to do the work on the trench stuff in parallel, you know, Jim said we'd start with finance, doing the financing part, availability. I actually disagree with Tom on the rail operations. I think support continued rail operation Caltrain service improvements. I think making that explicit is really important. And I do
That
think
can be
we should
convinced.
move up the minimize, I actually think it's minimize, do away with the word cost and just say minimize eminent domain and make that a tier 2 criteria. And then, I'm not so sure we need a tier 3 criteria. We may just have tier 1 criteria and tier 2 criteria, unless you want to break some of these out. I mean.
Well, disruption of doing
Right, so we could
construction.
make minimize disruption and duration of construction activities tier 3. You
Well,
could.
so we still have cost feasibility under tier 3.
But I mean, cost feasibility has to be under tier 1, I think. I mean, if it's not feasible, in fact, it should be the number 1 criteria. I mean, if it's not feasible to do it, we should drop it. I mean, so I'd actually make that tier 1. You disagree?
I just think it's a fundraising effort, right? So it happens over time, and like knowing up front something is, absolutely feasible. Depends what kind of, you're talking like order of magnitude feasibility versus more accurate.
I realize the term feasible is squishy.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, what may be feasible but I think at the end of the day, that's sort of a.
But until we've done the work, it's hard to know.
Yeah, but you can't engage on the fundraising and decide you're going to see if it works and then end up not having any grade separations. You've got to have a plan that's feasible, right? I mean, I don't think the plan could be, hopefully someone will donate the money, for instance. Right?
So
It's got to be like we did with the infrastructure.
But the plan could involve private money, business impact money, a bunch of other things that we haven't been talking about.
If I could just jump in here. So the evaluation matrix that'll be created using these evaluation criteria will be used to inform the decision-making process. The matrix itself is not going to make the decisions. So the way this could play out is under rail operations, for example. Let's say we get into a 1% versus 1.5% debate with Caltrain, and they say, well, we could accept 1.25%, but not 1.5%. The alternative that has that 1.5% would have a lower score under rail operations
But
because
support passenger rail operations.
we could certainly. So it's basically, this is just going to help facilitate the decision-making process. So the feasibility of the funding would be something that would be, if we're building something that only uses Measure B funding because it only costs $90 million, let's say that would be have a high score under funding feasibility. But if we pick something that's going to require a local referendum, that's, we haven't done any polling on and have no idea, that would have a lower score under funding feasibility. But it's not going to be automatically dismissed because the decision will ultimately be up to council.
So, getting back to what Tom said, what you just said, I don't think we should be scoring that until we did the polling. Do you know what I mean? I mean, what I don't want to have happen in this process is we make decisions with very limited information when we could get better information.
Yeah.
So I would actually give you a hard time if you came here and said, we scored this low because we haven't done polling yet. I'd say, well, let's go do the poll.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly probably how it would. I mean, we could leave it blank till we do polling and not score it. But I mean, I just wanted to be clear about how this will be used.
Okay, I just don't want to get to a situation with the bridge where, we have the entire community go through this, we choose something, and then we are really rushed for time. And we just basically do the opposite of CSS, which is we say, okay, we're just doing this grade separation just like this because we have no more time and we need to do, we've had a 5-year process, and we went down the wrong path.
So mostly agree with the mayor. I do think the rail operations bullet is important, as is something about financial feasibility. And I think, per Tom's point, that could be a broad feasibility catch at that point. If we're going to move the minimize use of eminent domain for this project into tier 2, I agree. I think we can get rid of tier 3, the construction criteria, minimizing disruption and duration of construction activities at any single location. It's a nice to have. I think we're going to do that anyways, and it shouldn't just be the one hanging out in tier 3.
So you're saying move it to tier 2?
I think we could strike it and just move the right-of-way acquisitions of that eminent domain bullet point into tier 2.
So
And
I
then-
guess one thing that we would be missing, and again, I'm okay leaving rail operations in, which just struck me as we're going to do it anyways. That was my only point. But the issue of construction disruptions, not only to vehicle traffic, but also rail operations. So are we suddenly
impact on
creating
current
a
rail
conflict there? I mean, are we gonna like not consider an alternative because it has some construction impacts on operations?
That's fair.
No, that's fair, but I actually like keeping minimize disruption and duration. I was just going to move it to tier 2. But
yeah, I'm okay with that.
But
We just have
you
two
know,
tiers.
But if staff for some reason wants tier 3, I mean, 3 tiers, we could break up tier 2 into tier 3, and we could have 2 and 2 tier 2.
That's I guess that's a little persuasive. Maybe that at any single location is a little funny then. I guess that was making me think.
Why don't we just say duration of construction activities?
Yeah, that was making me think, like, we're not gonna impact a single household so badly for this, but I think, Tom, your point about, like, it could be existing service or other right of
Well,
ways.
if we take that house, and we'll.
Well, we're not gonna take the house, right? We're trying to minimize that.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay, so I think this is mainly just kind of feedback. I don't know if we need a motion. I did have a couple other comments on, so on the council meeting on September 5th, what are we taking to council?
So I think a motion from you directing us to incorporate your feedback into the problem statement, objectives, and evaluation criteria that we present to City Council on September 5th would be helpful.
So moved.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay, but is that the only thing being taken to council?
Yeah, well, we'll also, probably most likely have a discussion about the process again, and we'll, provide the direction that we were given by PTC and Rail Committee to council.
The other thing I got to say, I'm pretty concerned that on the engagement plan around the alternatives, you're saying we may not even have this second workshop. I mean, the amount of people that can participate in a focus group on probably one of the most key steps is making me a little nervous.
So I thought, I'm with Tom. I think we should have we should do both. I thought the focus group was an additive, to be honest, not.
Well, I heard him say maybe we don't do.
No,
that.
that's why I'm
Yeah.
supporting you on this.
Yeah. So I think we need to think about that.
We can do both. We can do a community workshop and focus groups. I think focus groups will enable us to get a little deeper in the discussion and spend more time.
Yeah, I'm a little bit concerned about even just 2 meetings on alternatives, if that's going to be sufficient, but.
This whole process is designed to be flexible, so I think if after October 21st, we don't feel like we have closure on the development of the alternatives, we could have another discussion with the community.
So do we need to add to the motion the idea about the trench white paper?
Yes, just add that in.
Is that okay? Yep. All right.
I just need a little clarity. Would you like the white paper to focus on just the trench under Charleston and Meadow, or a trench along the entire corridor?
No, it doesn't work on the entire corridor. Why would we spend the time on that?
Okay, so the white
everyone said
paper-
you can't go past Oregon, right? I mean, that's what we've been told.
I don't know, I'd be interested in understanding that.
Yeah, I would be interested in seeing the entire corridor and if there is that issue, spelling it out in the white paper.
So Hillary, I think, wants to jump in, but the complexity of a paper focused on the entire corridor would have I think it would lead to a longer turnaround time for the paper. I think we could deliver something on the Charleston Meadow one a little bit quicker and go a little deeper than we could if we were to look at the entire corridor.
What I wanted to add is maybe tearing off of the chair's comments earlier about constraints. Instead of a white paper that focuses solely on the trench, I was wondering if we couldn't, broaden it to just be more about the constraints that we're going to face along along the corridor with all of these things, particularly below-grade solutions. I mean, we've done some work on that in the past, but that needs to be relooked at and refreshed. And it might be a way to make it just a little broader than just the trench at these two crossings.
Yeah, it sounds good. I think, constraints and maybe if there's any mitigations for constraints. But I think the other part of it was getting a ballpark pricing too at some point, costing.
Yeah, I mean, we had that ballpark pricing in the first Mott McDonald study. We'll dust that off, take a look at it, refine it as we can at this point.
Well, I think it's more than that. I'm not okay with that direction. I think I don't want to have the $10 parking garage because that's the best you can dust off. I mean, I'm fine with an iteration on this, but I really do think we need to start honing in on whether or not that trench is feasible. And, when we talked about this previously, and look, if you want to do a light touch across the entire trench, and if it is possibly feasible, I'm interested in it, but all the work that came back to us last time indicated that a trench over the entire corridor was not feasible. Now, if that's changed, great. I mean, but let us know. But
If I can clarify, I mean, that last study, which we linked to in the report you got today, concluded that the longer trench was like a $1 billion project, and the Charleston Meadow trench the 1% trench was $1 billion project, and part of it is because it went farther than just Charleston Meadow. It had to go and impacted the Caltrain station and the Caltrain undercrossing and all of that, as well as the Oregon Expressway undercrossing. So there were all kinds of costs associated with the fact that it lengthened the footprint.
So put all that in the white paper.
Okay.
I agree. But let's not just stop with a white paper. I mean,
Yeah.
I think we need to hone in on what's feasible in terms of a trench and what's not.
So I think a good format for the white paper would be to look at constraints to a longer trench, but then go a little deeper into the Charleston Meadow trench and look at, sharpening our pencil on the cost estimate. And
Right. That sounds good.
Okay, so I know you have time constraint. If
I
we
do.
could quickly get through item 3, which is the Union Pacific letter.
Okay.
Was that already sent?
Was it already sent? What do we
this
do?
is just an informational item for the committee to show you that the letter was sent.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we had a motion on the floor and no vote yet on item 2.
Okay, so
All in favor?
all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. So quickly on upcoming schedule and agendas. So we have Samtrans hopefully in the next meeting. What else is on the future agenda?
We'll be bringing you an agenda for the September 16th community workshop. I'm sorry, what's the next date of the rail committee is? Do you know where it's? Second week.
I probably have it.
Yeah, so we'll be going over the agenda and the planning for the community workshop on September 16th. And we'll also be recapping what the outcome was from the council meeting.
So I have a rail meeting on September 13th. Is that incorrect?
Yeah, I have September 13th from 8 to 10 on my calendar as well.
Okay.
So we are doing one on the 6th or not?
When we decide if we're going to move it.
Currently on the tentative, it's for Wednesday, September 13th at 8 a.m.
Is there a reason to change it?
Oh, you know what? There is a reason to change it. The issue is that that's where the league meeting is.
In Sacramento.
Exactly.
So can everybody make the 6th?
I can make the 6th.
We may have to see it.
We do a CA, but that's at 3 in the afternoon.
All right, so can clerk
September
please,
September 6th?
yes,
Okay,
make sure
no problem.
Eric Filseth knows.
I will.
The other thing, you talked about not starting the Dumbarton Rail letter. I guess if we move the meeting up, we'll have more time. But if it's possible to even outline a draft letter for that meeting, I think it would be worthwhile. All right. Okay. Anything else? All right. Thank you, guys. Long meeting. Meeting adjourned.
Good job, Tom.